Thames, Sacred River, by Peter Ackroyd. The Mirror of History, read by Simon Callow. The River as Fact. It has a length of 215 miles and is navigable for 191 miles. It is the longest river in England, but not in Britain, where the Severn is longer by approximately 5 miles. Nevertheless, it must be the shortest river in the world to acquire such a famous history. The Amazon and the Mississippi cover almost 4,000 miles, and the Yangtze almost 3,500 miles, but none of them has arrested the attention of the world in the manner of the Thames. It runs along the borders of 9 English counties, thus reaffirming its identity as a boundary and as a defence. It divides Wiltshire from Gloucestershire, Gloucestershire from Berkshire, Oxfordshire from Buckinghamshire. As it pursues its way, it divides Surrey from Middlesex, or Greater London, as it is inelegantly known, and Kent from Essex. There are 135 bridges along the length of the Thames, and 44 locks above Teddington. There are approximately 20 major tributaries still flowing into the main river, while others, such as the Fleet, have now disappeared under the ground. Its basin, the area from which it derives its water from rain and other natural forces, covers an area of some 5,264 square miles. And then there are the springs, many of them in the woods or close to the streams beside the Thames. There is one in the wood below Snowdon Hills in Oxfordshire, for example, which has been described as an everlasting spring, always fresh and always renewed. The average flow of the river at Teddington, chosen because it marks the place where the tidal and non-tidal waters touch, has been calculated at 1,145 millions of gallons each day, or approximately 2,000 cubic feet per second. The main thrust of the river flow is known to hydrologists as the Tallweg. It does not move in a straight and forward line, but mingling with the inner flow and the variegated flow of the surface and bottom waters takes the form of a spiral, or helix. More than 95% of the river's energy is lost in turbulence and friction. The direction of the flow of the Thames is therefore quixotic. It might be assumed that it would move eastwards, but it defies any simple prediction. It flows northwest above Henley and at Teddington, west above Abingdon, south from Cookham, and north above Marlow and Kingston. This has to do with the variegated curves of the river. It does not meander, like the Euphrates, where, according to Herodotus, the voyager came upon the same village 3 times on 3 separate days, but it is circuitous. It specializes in loops. It will take the riparian traveller 2 or 3 times as long to cover the same distance as a companion on the high road. So the Thames teaches you to take time, and to view the world from a different vantage. The average fall or decline of the river from its beginning to its end is approximately 17 to 21 inches per mile. It follows gravity, and seeks out perpetually the simplest way to the sea. It falls some 600 feet from source to sea, with a relatively precipitous decline of 300 feet in the first 9 miles. It falls 100 more in the next 11 miles, with a lower average for the rest of its course. The mean width of the river is given as 1,000 feet, and a mean depth of 30 feet, but the width varies from 1 or 2 feet at Shrewsbury to 5.5 miles at the Nore. The tide, in the words of Tennyson, is that which moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam. It is one general movement, but it comprises 1,000 different streams and eddies, and high water is not necessarily the same thing as high tide. The water will sometimes begin to fall before the tide is over. The average speed of the tide lies between 1 and 3 knots, but at times of very high flow it can reach 7 knots. At London Bridge, the flood tide runs for almost 6 hours, while the ebb tide endures for 6 hours and 30 minutes. The tides are much higher now than at other times in the history of the Thames. There can now be a difference of some 24 feet between high and low tides, although the average rise in the area of London Bridge is between 15 and 22 feet. In the period of the Roman occupation it was a little over 3 feet. The high tide, in other words, has risen greatly over a period of 2,000 years. The reason is simple. The southeast of England is sinking, slowly, into the water at the rate of approximately 12 inches per century. In 4000 BC, the land beside the Thames was 46 feet higher than it is now, and in 3000 BC, it was some 31 feet higher. When this is combined with the water issuing from the dissolution of the polar ice caps, the tides moving up the lower reaches of the Thames are increasing at a rate of 2 feet per century. That is why the recently erected Thames barrier will not provide protection enough, and another barrier is being proposed. The tide, of course, changes in relation to the alignment of Earth, Moon, and Sun. Every 2 weeks the high spring tides reach their maximum 2 days after a full moon, while the low neap tides occur at the time of the half-moon. The highest tides occur at the times of equinox. This is the period of maximum danger for those who live and work by the river. The spring tides of late autumn and early spring are also hazardous. It is no wonder that the earliest people by the Thames venerated and propitiated the river. The Thames has taken the same course for 10,000 years, after it had been nudged southward by the glaciation of the last ice age. The British and Roman earthworks by the Snowdon Hills still border the river, as they did 2,000 years before. Given the destructive power of the moving waters, this is a remarkable fact. Its level has varied over the millennia. There is a sudden and unexpected rise at the time of the Anglo-Saxon settlement, for example, and the discovery of submerged forests testifies to incidents of overwhelming flood. Its appearance has, of course, also altered, having only recently taken the form of a relatively deep and narrow channel, but its persistence and identity through time are an aspect of its power. Yet, of course, every stretch has its own character and atmosphere and history. There is the overwhelming difference of water within it, varying from the pure fresh water of the source through the brackish zone of estuarial water to the salty water in proximity to the sea. Given the eddies of the current, in fact, there is rather more salt by the Essex shore than by the Kentish shore. There are manifest differences between the riverine landscapes of Lechlade and of Battersea, of Henley and of Gravesend. The upriver calm is in marked contrast to the turbulence of the long stretches known as River of London and then London River. After Newbridge, the river becomes wider and deeper in anticipation of its change. The rural landscape itself changes from flat to wooded in rapid succession, and there is a great alteration in the nature of the river from the cultivated fields of Dorchester to the thick woods of Cliveden. From Godstow, the river becomes a place of recreation, breezy and jaunty with the skiffs and the punts, the sports in Port Meadow and the picnic parties on the banks by Binsey. But then, by some change of light, it becomes dark green, surrounded by vegetation like a jungle river, and then the traveller begins to see the dwellings of Oxford, and the river changes again. Oxford is a pivotal point. From there you can look upward and consider the quiet source, or you can look downstream and contemplate the coming immensity of London. In the reaches before Lechlade, nothing comes close to the water, and it makes its way through isolated pastures. At Wapping and Rotherhithe the dwellings seem to drop into it, as if overwhelmed by numbers. It is the river of dreams, but it is also the river of suicide. It has been called liquid history, because within itself it dissolves and carries all epochs and generations. They ebb and flow like water. The river as metaphor. The river runs through the language, and we speak of its influence in every conceivable context. It is employed to characterize life and death, time and destiny. It is used as a metaphor for continuity and dissolution, for intimacy and transitoriness, for art and history, for poetry itself. In the Principles of Psychology, 1890, William James first coined the phrase stream of consciousness, in which every definite image of the mind is steeped in the free water that flows around it. Thus it flows, like the river itself. Yet the river is also a token of the unconscious, with its suggestion of depth and invisible life. The river is a symbol of eternity, in its unending cycle of movement and change. It is one of the few such symbols that can readily be understood or appreciated, and in the continuing stream the mind or soul can begin to contemplate its own possible immortality. In the poetry of John Denham's Cooper's Hill, 1642, the Thames is a metaphor for human life. How slight its beginning, how confident its continuing course, how ineluctable its destination within the great ocean. hasting to pay his tribute to the sea, like mortal life to meet eternity. The poetry of the Thames has always emphasized its affiliations with human purpose and with human realities. So the personality of the river changes in the course of its journey from the purity of its origins to the broad reaches of the commercial world. The river in its infancy is undefiled, innocent and clear. By the time it is closely pent in by the city, it has become dank and foul, defiled by greed and speculation. In this regress, it is the paradigm of human life and of human history. Yet the river has one great advantage over its metaphoric companions. It returns to its source, and its corruption can be reversed. That is why baptism was once instinctively associated with the river. The Thames has been an emblem of redemption and of renewal, of the hope of escaping from time itself. When Wordsworth observed the river at low tide, with the vista of the mighty heart of London lying still, he used the imagery of human circulation. It is the image of the river as blood pulsing through the veins and arteries of its terrain, without which the life of London would seize up. Sir Walter Raleigh, contemplating the Thames from the walk by his cell in the Tower, remarked that the blood which disperseth itself by the branches or veins through all the body may be resembled to these waters which are carried by brooks and rivers over all the earth. He wrote his History of the World, 1610, from his prison cell, and was deeply imbued with the current of the Thames as a model of human destiny. It has been used as the symbol for the unfolding of events in time, and carries the burden of past events upon its back. The Thames has also been understood as a mirror of morality. The bending rushes and the yielding willows afford lessons in humility and forbearance. The humble weeds along its banks have been praised for their lowliness and absence of ostentation. And who has ventured upon the river without learning the value of patience, of endurance, and of vigilance? John Denham makes the Thames the subject of native discourse, in a further sense. "Oh, could I flow like thee, and make thy stream my great example as it is my theme, though deep yet clear, though gentle yet not dull, strong without rage, without o'erflowing full." This suggests that the river represents an English measure, an aesthetic harmony to be sought or wished for, but in the same breath Denham seems to be adverting to some emblem of Englishness itself. The Thames is a metaphor for the country through which it runs. It is modest and moderate, calm and resourceful. It is powerful without being fierce. It is not flamboyantly impressive. It is large without being too vast. It eschews extremes. It weaves its own course without artificial diversions or interventions. It is useful for all manner of purposes. It is a practical river. When Robert Menzies, an erstwhile Australian Prime Minister, was taken to Runnymede, he was moved to comment upon the secret springs of the slow English character. This identification of the land with the people, the characteristics of the earth and water with the temperament of their inhabitants, remains a poignant one. In some sense, then, the Thames becomes the image of the nation, mollifying land and water in one capacious embrace, affording coherence and unity to disparate regions. It permits the growth and spread of a common culture. It creates harmony out of apparent discord, and in that capacity alone it has done more to establish the idea of Englishness than any other national feature. The idealized images of English life, with their thatched cottages and village greens, their duck ponds and hedged fields, derive from the landscape of the Thames. The river is the source of these daydreams of Englishness. The traveller need only journey to Cookham, or to Pangbourne, or to Streatley, or to 100 other villages and small towns along the Thames to recognise the enduring importance of the river in the characterisation of national life. The Thames has been a highway, a frontier, and an attack route. It has been a playground and a sewer, a source of water and a source of power. It has been what the Romans called a public river, but it has also been a scene of deep private contentment. It has a personal and an historical force. John Keel, in An Examination of the Reflections on the Theory of the Earth, 1699, remarked of rivers that without them there could be no great towns, nor any converse with far inland countries, since without them it is almost impossible to supply a vast multitude of people with things necessary for life. The Thames has created civilization here. It fashioned London. That is why it has been described as a museum of Englishness itself. It embodies the history of the nation, from Greenwich to Windsor, from Eton to Oxford, from the Tower to the Abbey, from the City to the Court, from the Port of London to Runnymede. It is, in that sense, a great unifier. It suggests the community of struggling human beings who have always lived beside it. It represents the idealized and harmonious landscape of the country, too, particularly in those territories that border the upper Thames. It has inspired the poetry of the English. It is heterogeneous and various, thus perfectly satisfactory to the national taste. The sundry varying soils, the pleasures infinite, where heat kills not the cold, nor cold expels the heat, the summer not too short, the winter not too long. Thus Michael Drayton apostrophizes the Thames in his Polyolbion, 1612. Yet it remains relatively unspoiled. It has not greatly changed in the last 2,000 years of human time. For much of its course, the river remains secluded and remote. It is still possible to walk along the path beside it and see no one for many miles. In the upper areas near the source, and in the estuarial areas, there is the same isolation. It represents an escape from the world, by the margin, willow-veiled. That is why it has a reputation for being placid, for being free from turmoil. Matthew Arnold said of the river at Staines that it has yet a great charm from its entire loneliness. Canvey Island, in the estuary, was once described as the loneliest place in the home counties. The time of the river. It is history, the river of history, along which most of the significant events of the last 2,000 years have taken place. But it is also the river as history. The closer it advances towards London, the more historical it becomes. That is its underlying nature. It has reflected the moving pageant of the ages. Its history is, of course, that of England, or rather of the Britons and the Romans, the Saxons and the Danes and the Normans and the other migrating groups who decided to settle somewhere along its banks. Art and civilization have flourished alongside it. Each generation has a different understanding of it, so that it has accumulated meaning over the centuries. In that process, it has become a token of national character. The destiny of England is intimately linked with the destiny of the river. In mythic accounts, it gives the island energy. It gives it fertility. No one would deny the central importance of the Thames to London. It brought its trade, and in so doing lent beauty, squalor, wealth, misery, and dignity to the city. London could never have existed without the Thames. That is why the river has always been central to English life, and can fairly claim to be the most historic and certainly the most eventful river in the world. You can learn more about the human condition in a voyage along the Thames than on any long journey over the oceans of the world. But water reflects. It has no form of its own. It has no meaning. So we may say that the Thames is in essence a reflection of circumstances, a reflection of geology, or of economics. It has been the focus of human life ever since the first humans entered the region. So from the river we acquire an idea of human community. Along its banks the same methods of farming were used from the Bronze Age to the middle of the 19th century. The meadows were cut by long-handled scythes, and the heavy soil was ploughed. The wheat was sown and harvested, with the labourers cutting the corn with short sickles. The rushes were cut down in August to be used for thatching. Turf and brushwood were collected for the winter fire. These were ancient and persistent activities, helping to mould the landscape of the Thames while at the same time being moulded by it. Land divisions and field boundaries are a direct inheritance from our prehistoric forebearers. The technique of building dry stone walls has been preserved for some 6,000 years. The river offers a deep sense of settlement and of belonging. Time has a curious presence upon the river. The Thames does not live in human time. It lives in geological time. In The Historical Thames, Hilaire Belloc writes that you might put a man of the 15th century on the water below St. John's Lock, and until he came to Buscott Lock, he would hardly know that he had passed into a time other than his own. John Betjeman described the whole river above Oxford as medieval, and there is a sense in which it remains a perpetual remembrance of time past. There was an old rhyme, "Ring out the bell from every steeple, it makes no difference to boating people." The people of the river are suspended in the river's time. Yet, curious enough, water has also been employed as a measurement of human time. The water clock, or clepsydra, was in use many thousands of years ago, and the first of these devices was a simple jar with a hole drilled through its bottom. But the Thames itself makes some claim to being the place where time begins, since on its banks at Greenwich is the site of the prime meridian. A large red time ball, constructed in 1833, rises up a pole on the turret of the observatory and falls at precisely 1 p.m. as the signal of Greenwich Mean Time. So the eternal river enters the human world. The flow of the Thames has inspired another form of measurement. The Brigittine convent at Sion and the Charterhouse at Sheen faced each other on opposite banks, and Henry VI declared that immediately upon the cessation of the service at one convent, it should commence at the other, and so should continue until the end of time. These perpetually flowing orisons are a spiritual image of the water running between them. The Thames can become an emblem both of time and of eternity, the Janus-faced aspects of the river like the sculptured heads on Henley Bridge looking both upriver and downriver. In his book The Stripling Thames, 1909, Fred Thacker pronounced it thus: "Ancient river, changing never, symbol of eternity, gliding water, lapsing ever, mirror of inconstancy." It is the perpetual paradox. One stretch, in itself inconsiderable, can act as a microcosm of the national life. There is a spot at Brentford from which the Brentford ferry once ran. It is just downriver from a patch of land on the north bank of the Thames that for several centuries was known simply as Old England. It is now known on the maps as Old Brentford. Close by this spot, that marks the old ferry, the Cassivelloni fought against the invading force of Caesar in BC 54. In the same place, 834 years later, Offa held a council of the church with his bishops. In the same place, in AD 1016, Edmund Ironside drove Knut and his defeated Danes across the Thames. This was also the place, in 1642, where part of the Battle of Brentford was fought between the forces of Charles I and the Parliamentary Army. If there are riverine locations imbued with the spirits of the past, then this, surely, is one of them. That may be the reason why the course of the river has been employed as a clue to the course of history itself. The Thames summons up the ideals of the past as they flow into the present and advance towards the future. When Turner sailed down the Thames with his sketchbook upon his lap, he was moved to create images of Dido and Aeneas, of Pompey and Cornelia, all the symbols of the mythological and classical past congregating by the banks. It would not be too wonderful to see the mother of Moses or the daughter of a pharaoh suddenly appear among the rushes on the banks of the upper Thames. The water here shares the same antiquity. One peer of the realm and adorer of the river, Francis Noel Buxton, decided to brave its waters on the 25th of March, 1952. He wished to test his theory that the Romans had crossed or forded the river by what is now the Westminster Embankment. He decided to cross the water on foot, with the hope or expectation that there would still be some kind of path below the swirling and muddy waters. He went at low tide, which he estimated at 5 feet 3 inches, while his own height was 6 feet 3 inches. But the river did not accord with his calculations. He went down after reaching the second pier of Westminster and was compelled to swim the remaining distance. It was deeper and darker than he had imagined, but Lord Noel Buxton described himself as a poetical archaeologist, concerned to invoke the underlying terrain of the river around us. He had seen the marsh that lay beneath the edifices of Westminster, and enumerated the plants that had once grown there. He glimpsed in imagination the palace of Knut and the little Saxon monastery that had once stood on the site of the great abbey. This is a form of poetic field-walking, to use another archaeological term, in which the traces of the past are there for those who have eyes to see. It is worth reflecting that when you set out upon the river, you become in some way detached from the mundane world. That world becomes more remote, as if in passing from land to water you had crossed some other boundary into a different sense of time. The river elongates time. By winding so crookedly, it is in peril of losing itself in the labyrinth of its own making. At Penton Hook, between Chertsey and Staines, the river takes half a mile to travel a total distance of 20 yards, 18 metres. By Blackwall, the Thames crosses the meridian 3 times, an apt token of its waywardness. The river is ever flowing, but of course it is not eternal. It will cease, at that moment when the world itself ceases. But to human perception it is the closest imaginable approximation to everlasting process. The river will always run. Longfellow wrote that on the broad river the slow years sailed by and ceased to be. Those who know the Thames well adopt a leisurely pace. There are stretches where the water seems to move reluctantly. There are still traces of archaic village life in the settlements beside the upper Thames. Some villages, Lechlade and Cricklade, for example, seem to be preserved in their old age, as if they were in implicit communion with the river that has always served them. Kenneth Grahame, the creator of Thames mythology in The Wind in the Willows, 1908, remarked of one river village that it possessed a holy calm and a natural life of somnolency. The wanderer by the river bank is in turn a loafer, and through golden spaces of imagination his soul is winging her untrammelled flight. That is for many the natural occupation of the river wanderer, set free from the world of days and hours in order to soar among dreams. Those who dream by the river may dream of the future as well as of the past. Yet it is hard to determine, in the life of the Thames, what is the beginning and what is the end. The concept of the hydrologic cycle, from sea to river, from river to sea, poses a problem for those who exist in linear time. Can the Thames ever be said to really end? And if so, where does this ending take place? Its end, theoretically, is the point at which it begins again. While it is continually going forward, it is also going backward. Isaac Rosenberg said of Stanley Spencer, who painted the Thames at Cookham on many occasions, that his pictures have that sense of everlastingness, of no beginning and no end, that we get in all masterpieces. It may be that Spencer was imbued with this quality of everlastingness by his life near the river. There is a case for saying that the water of the river is everlastingly new, fresh, and ever renewed. There are some curious physical facts to bolster the metaphysical argument. The Thames from Lechlade to Teddington, what could be called the non-tidal Thames, contains approximately some 4,500 million gallons. The amount of rainfall in that region has been calculated as 4,360 million gallons. It is new water, perpetually circulated, perpetually purified, perpetually replenished. But another curious statistical fact will cast a strange light on this newness. One drop of water fallen in the Cotswolds will have been drunk by 8 different people before it reaches the sea. It is taken out, purified, and then reintroduced to the river. It can never be quite the same as it was yesterday, or last month, or 100 million years ago. Or can it? It is the secret of its eternal renewal. Father Thames. Baptism. Thames is an old name. With the exception of Kent, it is perhaps the most ancient name recorded in England. It is assumed to be of the same origin as that of the rivers Tamar, Team, and Taff. They may all be derived from Celtic tam, meaning smooth or wide-spreading. Isa, I-S-A, or Isa, E-S-A, are both versions of a Celtic root word meaning running water, as in the present ooze and ex. Oxford is a corruption of Oosenford or Osenford. So we may construct a provisional translation for the Thames as running ooze. But this is merely informed supposition. The word may have another origin altogether. There is a river Temes in Hungary that flows into the Danube. There is a river Tamese in Italy, and the principal town of the Brutii in southern Italy was called Temesa. There is also a tributary of the Ganges known in Sanskrit as Tamasa. It derives from Sanskrit tamasa, or dark. In the second book of the Hindu text Ramayana there is a chapter on the Tamasa. so the name could be pre-Celtic. It may spring from the primordial tribes of the Mesolithic or Neolithic periods. The syllable Thame may indeed indicate darkness, in the sense of holy or sacred fearfulness. It may be very ancient indeed, going back to the first naming of the world. It is a matter of interest, then, that in the 19th and early 20th centuries the Thames was often described as the Dark River, in unwitting echo of its first description. Perhaps it was not renamed by the Celts or the Romans or the Saxons because it was considered to be a numinous word. The river was known to the Celts as Tamesa or Tamesis. The Romans, in the shape of the conqueror Julius Caesar, translated it as Tamesis. This was also the name known to Tacitus and Dion Cassius. For the settling Saxons, it became more simply Themas or Temese. The fact that it retained its final S, a rare occurrence in Anglo-Saxon, suggests very strongly that the Saxons knew the word already before its Celtic or Roman vesture. They had heard of the Thames as a great river over the seas. In a manuscript of 699, it is called Tamise. For Nennius, in his chronicles of the 8th and early 9th centuries, it is Tamisia. The name has no less than 21 variants in its Latin and Saxon forms, with a further 9 in Middle English, but without exception they include Thame or Team. This is the sacred element, this putative word for darkness. It soon enters chronicle history, within the ancient charters of the Anglo-Saxons. In the first of them, extant from the 7th century, there are references to land belonging to Abbot Aldhelm, cuius vocabulum Themis juxta vadum qui appellatur Somerford. Somerford Keynes still exists beside the Thames, no more than 2 or 3 miles from the source. It has a church built by Aldhelm himself, with a Viking carving and the vestiges of Saxon watermills. The baptism of a river requires the figure of a guardian or deity. Lud, Celtic divinity of the Londoners, a mysterious and insubstantial god, may be related to Nud or Nodens, who is the presiding deity of the Seven, but on these curious matters no certainty can be found. There is a more rotund figure in the form of Old Father Thames, a water divinity of unknown origin who bears a striking resemblance to the tutelary gods of the Nile and the Tiber. His flowing beard and hair call up the strange association between hair and water. The Ganges was supposed to flow through the matted hair of Shiva. In Leonardo's notebooks there are drawings of hair and water that have been closely aligned, as if in the swirls and ripples of the water there was an echo of human organism. A Greco-Roman sculpture of the Tiber, with flowing beard and hair, is dated from the 1st century BC. It is to be found at the base of the staircase of the Capitoline Hill in Rome. In the same setting reclines the god of the Nile, with similar appearance and pose. In the myths of Greece and Rome, Achelous, the god of all rivers, is also the fount or source of all knowledge. He mourned the loss of one of his horns in combat with Hercules. That became the Horn of Plenty, which in turn was transformed into the urn held by Father Thames. This can be construed as an expression of the fact that the river, once tamed, becomes fruitful. Yet the images also suggest other attributes. Achelous is a strong god who can be tempted to fierceness and anger. He is ancient, but he has the gift of perpetual self-renewal, so that he holds within himself the secret of eternal youth. That is the origin of the Fountain of Youth. His avatar, Old Father Thames, is commemorated in a statue once at Thames Head but now removed to Lechlade, the site of the first lock upon the water. He is here surrounded by barrels and bales of goods, in homage to the Thames as a river of commerce as well as sacred power. He also carries a spade as an emblem of the industry required to create the locks that have in part tamed the water. There is another sculpture in the grounds of Ham House beside the river, where it is known simply as the River God. This is from the mid-18th century, 100 years older than the image at Lechlade, and the god holds an urn in homage to a more ancient sense of sacredness. There's a sculpture of Father Thames in Trinity Square, where it acts as Genius Loci for the erstwhile headquarters of the Port of London Authority. The god carries a trident, and with his other hand points eastwards towards the open sea. Once more his beard and hair are carefully detailed. He surmounts the emblems of produce and exportation, commerce and navigation. There is a bronze figure of Father Thames in the courtyard of Somerset House, and on the Strand front of that building there is a keystone carved in his image. There are great sculpted heads of Father Thames at the river entrance of Hammersmith Town Hall, and upon Vauxhall Bridge there is a bas-relief of the god in combat with the creatures of the deep. There is an image upon Kew Bridge, and another upon the bridge at Henley, where his hair and beard are surrounded by bulrushes and fish. So he has not altogether been forgotten. He is still the deity revered by one of the great celebrants of the Thames, Alexander Pope, who described his tresses dropped with dews, and o'er the stream his shining horns diffused a golden gleam. Graved on his urn appeared the moon that guides his swelling waters and alternate tides. The poetry of John Denham in Cooper's Hill was once considered to be the purest in the language, as smooth and as mellifluous as the river that he invoked. He also paid homage to its deity as Thames, the most loved of all the ocean's sons. It would seem, then, that he comes from an old and distinguished family. He has a companion, however, who may claim even greater age and distinction. The god of the Egyptians, Isis, has been generally associated with the Thames. The river itself has indeed been compared with the Nile, generally because of its fertility and its central place in the kingdom through which it flows. Sacrificial victims were thrown into the Nile to appease its deities. We will find the same rituals beside the banks of the Thames. There are reaches of the Thames that effortlessly summon up memories of the Nile. A stretch of the river just before Cricklade contains rushes and quicksands. A dreamy and melancholy passage of water at Chelsea has been compared to the Egyptian river. More importantly, however, the Nile and the tidal Thames contain intimations of death and rebirth, and of perpetual resurgence. They are both considered to be dark rivers. One of the most famous monuments by the river must surely be that known as Cleopatra's Needle, although the obelisk has only a slender connection with the famous queen. But it does, however, have some association with the Nile. It was created by Pharaoh Thutmose III, and for 1,500 years it stood at Heliopolis beside the east bank of the Nile. It was transported to the Thames in 1878 and set upon the bank by means of hydraulic power. Its pink granite, quarried at Syene, has been blackened by the fogs and smoke of London. It is now the same colour as the river itself, a hallowed token of the turbid and mysterious Thames. The connection between the Thames and the Nile is first made in the Polychronicon, or Universal History, of Ranulphus Higden, monk of Chester, who lived in the first half of the 14th century. In that compilation of medieval learning, Higden writes that Thamesia videtur compone a nominibus duorum fluminium, que sunt Tama et Isa aut Usa. Thus, in translation, Thamesis seems to be composed from the names of two rivers, that are the Tama and the Isa or Usa. It is more than probable that the Isa and Usa of Higden's account are in fact from the Celtic Isa or Isa. In the 14th century, then, the people along the banks of the river knew it from its Celtic term. Perhaps it was always known as the Isa. But then the historical record works its own recondite miracle. It was easy enough for Isa to become the resplendent Isis. The error was promulgated by John Leyland in his Itinerary, 1546, where he announced that Isis riseth at 3 miles from Cirencester. William Camden, in his Britannia, 1586, uses the same name in a record of Isis vulgo Ouse, or Isis commonly known as the Ouse. It was without evidence or corroboration, but it proved remarkably suggestive. The same explanation was followed by Holinshead and Stowe. Such was Leyland's prestige, in fact, that no one cared to dispute it. In the late 17th century, for example, the Welsh scholar Edward Lewid followed Leyland as one against whom I dare not contend. So in Parochialia, 1695, he writes of Dorchester as the place near where the Thames dischargeth himself into Isis, from whence the name Thamesis, the Thames, proceeds. By some strange process of misattribution and misunderstanding, Thamesis was then considered to be the conflation of Thames and Isis. A theory was then proposed to explain the phenomenon. The Isis emerged at the source and continued to Dorchester, while the element of Thames came from the river Tame that entered at Dorchester. A glance at the Anglo-Saxon records, where it was always known as the Thames, would alone render the supposition worthless. Nevertheless, it has persisted for centuries. The Parliamentary Acts from 1750 to 1842 refer to the rivers Thames and Isis, as does the Thames Conservancy Act of 1894. Even the maps of the Ordnance Survey still refer to its course from Thames Head to Dorchester as that of the River Thames or Isis. The naming of rivers is a difficult matter, but if it is a confusion, it is a fruitful one. The persistence of the fallacy of Thame and Isis suggests that it has some inner resonance, some essential rightness in defiance of the laws of etymology. Isis, after all, is charged with general human memory. She is the mother goddess, the benefactress of rivers. She is the womb of regeneration. She is the goddess of fertility, the lady of abundance, the sister and consort of Osiris, who rules the underworld. The fertile Thames emerges from unknown depths. She is the female soul of the world, the anima, who may appear in 1,000 different incarnations. 3 Roman effigies of the son of Isis, Horus, have been found in the waters by London Bridge. The image is that of the mother giving birth to the son on a tidal river, representing one of the most powerful of all myths of regeneration. The cult of Isis was maintained throughout the Roman Empire, and at the temple of Isis in Pompeii, water was sprinkled upon the heads of her adherents as blessing and benediction. The Thames itself was used for ritual inundation and Christian baptism. Isis was the winged goddess, hailed as the oldest of the old, who was the protectress of agriculture and of the arts of healing, of law and of justice. She was the provider of sweetness in assemblies. All of these activities, including the making of laws and the dispensing of justice, have for many centuries and perhaps for many thousands of years taken place beside the banks of the Thames. We may think of Runnymede. The Thames was the home of the Neolithic cursus. It is the home of the present Parliament. Thus, in the poetry of rivers she has become preeminent. In the verses of Spenser she is wreathed in ancientness like some primeval god. At the marriage feast in The Fairy Queen, the Thames is preceded by his ancient parents, namely the ancient Thame, but much more aged was his wife than he, the Ouse, whom men do Isis rightly name, full weak and crooked creature seemed she, and almost blind through eld, that scarce her way could see. In Drayton's Polyolbion there is a younger incarnation of the goddess. That Isis, Cotswold's heir, long wooed was lastly won, and instantly should wed with Thame, old Chiltern's son. And thus also in Wharton, beauteous Isis and her husband Thame, with mingled waves for ever flow the same. The poetry celebrates the sense of place, and creates in myth what has only a perilous and ambiguous foundation in fact. It is the story of the human race. Isis is herself the progenitrix of all the river nymphs and river goddesses who decorate the streams and springs of the world. They are known as water fays, water shapes, water nixies, water wreaths, water elves, and water fairies. Virgil names 50 of them in the Aeneid. The Severn is named after the British goddess Habrina, or Sabrina. The Clyde comes under the protection of Clota. The Dee belongs to Deva. Curiously enough, the Thames has been associated with no tutelary goddess, except, of course, Isis herself. The absence of a known female deity may well have prompted Leyland into making the connection with the Egyptian goddess in the first place. It was a way of affirming ancient beliefs about the power of the waters. That is why in 1806 Turner exhibited a painting of an idealized Thames, supposedly depicted at Weybridge, which he entitled Isis. It is a visionary conception of the river, with the darkening water flowing between great trees, and with what seems to be the fragment of a ruined temple in the foreground. When confronted with Father Thames and Isis as the assumed deities of the Thames, it is perhaps not surprising that there has been some debate concerning the gender of the river. The Thames seems to switch identity. In its upper reaches it is presumed to be feminine, and was known to William Morris as this far-off, lonely mother of the Thames. Yet as the river approaches London, it is deemed to be masculine. When the river is fierce or strong, it is also regarded as masculine. So sexual stereotypes prevail in the understanding of nature itself. The River of Stone. The basin of the Thames is largely enclosed by hills, with the Cotswold Hills to the extreme west. At their northern end, the Cotswolds sweep round towards Edge Hill, and then the hill wall moves across the central tableland until it reaches the long stretch of the East Anglian heights that proceed eastward. On the south side of the river, the hills forming the rim of the basin curve round by way of the Marlborough Downs, and then the North Downs that proceed to the coast of Kent. The area of the basin itself rarely rises more than 200 feet above sea level, and can be described as gently rippling, except for the great ridge of chalk that makes up the Chilterns. Over millennia, the Thames has made its way through the chalk, but the Chilterns remain as a token of ancient cataclysm. Above the area known as Goring Gap, where the river has forced its way through the ridge of chalk of which the Chilterns are a part, the topography consists of soft clay valleys and ridges formed out of sandstone or limestone. Below the Goring Gap, the river flows across the London Basin, comprised of chalk, sand, gravel and clay. The limestone of the Cotswolds to the west gives way to the area known as the Oxford Clay Vale, which is succeeded by the chalk of the Chilterns and the Berkshire Downs. Then, to the south of the Chilterns, lies the clay, which is in turn succeeded by sandstone, sand, and gravel. Of course, there are always local variations, dependent upon the flow of ancient oceans and the tumults of the primeval earth. There are areas of gravel and boulder clay, for example, that have been moved by the phenomenon of the ice ages known as glacial drift. The river, too, has deposited various layers of gravel and loam along its course. The area known as the London Basin provides an example of the variousness of the topography. It is made up of chalk overlaid with gravel and with clay, but the depth of the chalk varies at different locations. At Lambeth it lies 250 feet beneath the surface, while further downriver, at Rotherhithe, it is at a depth of 46 feet. The Saxon word for chalk is chilt, thus naming the Chilterns themselves. Above the chalk lie layers of red mottled clay and permeable sand, then the London clay, laid down some 60 million years ago, and above that gravel and brick earth. These ancient stones still play an essential role in the life of the river. Towns such as Greenwich and Greenhithe, Woolwich and Gravesend are built upon outcrops of chalk. Just at the point where the Thames curves to the south, immediately before the entrance of the Cherwell, there is a stretch of ancient gravel. This is the site of Oxford. The stones are the foundations of present life. The brick earth has, in addition, furnished the fabric of London dwellings. It has often been observed that the buildings of the Thames towns and villages seem to fit their surroundings, from the glowing Cotswold stone of a farmhouse to the flint walling and chalk plaster of a barn or dovecot. In every case, the stone is part of the genius loci. There was once the mystery of Dean holes by the river, large and interconnected subterranean tunnels, clustered around the banks of the Thames like large vase-shaped structures with narrow necks. They consist of a vertical shaft with a bell-like chamber underneath, connected to other similarly shaped chambers. It seems most likely that they were constructed by the Saxons for some form of chalk mining, but the evidence is unclear. There is also the phenomenon of the terraces, formed when there has been a fall in sea level. When the sea falls, the river cuts deeper through its previous floodplain, leaving it marked out as a terrace above the new floodplain. The Boyne Hill Terrace lies 100 feet above the present course of the river, for example, and was laid down some 375,000 years ago. This was succeeded by the Taplow Terrace, some 50 feet lower. The most recent is known more simply as the Floodplain Terrace. There are other gradations and variations of terraces with other names. The alluvial flood plain of the Upper Thames is a relatively new development, dating no further back than the 2nd millennium BC. But the terraces themselves are perhaps more obvious in London, where they must be surmounted by human ingenuity. The steep climb from the embankment to the Strand, by Charing Cross Underground Station, is the indication of a rift that took place over eons of time. The rise between the middle and upper terraces of the Thames can in turn be seen beside the National Gallery to the north of Trafalgar Square. We are treading upon prehistory. Birth. The source is the place of enchantment, where the boundary between the visible and invisible realms is to be found. It is commonly deemed to be a sanctuary, guarded or protected by the spirits of the young water. The water issuing from the dark earth can also be seen as an image of human existence emerging from the unknown. We trace the stream from darkness, from the very place of origin in its blind cavern, until it issues to the light and open day. It is a metaphor of birth and death, of beginning and ending. Water itself represents the beginning of every living thing. The journey towards the source is the journey backwards, away from human history. Force and purity come from the source. Youthfulness derives from the source. So springs the myth of the fountain of youth. It is the fons et origo. It is the well of life. The source has always been considered to be the origin of power and of good fortune. When Shalmaneser III of Assyria found the source of the Tigris, "I took victims to sacrifice to my gods. I held a joyful feast." Caesar told the high priest of Egypt that he would give up his wars if he could find the source of the Nile. Nero sent an expedition to find that same source without success. The source of the Yellow River, or Huanghu, a vital presence in China for many thousands of years and the genuine nurse of its culture, was not discovered until 1952. The Thames has two possible origins, one of them known as Seven Springs and the other more pertinently as Thames Head. Geographically, the palm might be awarded to Seven Springs in the parish of Coberley or Cubberley, north of Cirencester. It is further from the sea than Thames Head by some 12 miles, and at 700 feet, more than 300 feet higher above sea level. There is an ancient stone bulwark with 7 springs issuing from 7 small openings in its wall. On the stone has been fixed a plaque with the words "Hic tuus, O Tamesine pater, septem geminus fons." Here, O Father Thames, is your 7-sourced fountain. There is, however, one large impediment to this claim. The stream that issues from the 7 springs has always been known as the Churn, which eventually enters the Thames at Cricklade. No one doubts that it is ancient, only whether it is the source of the Thames. The historical records are, on this matter, in agreement about the claims of Thames Head. In the early 16th century, John Leyland stated that the Isis, by which name he called the Thames, rose not far from a village called Kemble, within half a mile of the Fossway. In the same century, John Stowe recorded that the most excellent and goodly river beginneth in Cotswold, about a mile from Titbury, and as much from the highway called Foss. And William Camden reported that it riseth not far from Tarleton, hard by the famous Fossway. The authorities could be multiplied, but the inference is clear. The Fossway has now been transfigured into the A433, but the source of the Thames is to be found in its immediate vicinity. It rises in a field known as Shrewsbury Mead, and lies beside a Roman camp which is now a mound still called Shrewsbury Castle. The camp was no doubt located there because of its proximity to the spring, and it is likely that more ancient peoples had a settlement in the same place. The name of the neighbouring village of Ewan is derived from the Saxon word for a spring or source. So from earliest times this place has been celebrated, or sanctified, as the place of flowing waters. Over the centuries the locale acquires its identity. Thomas Love Peacock expressed this process in his Pæan to the River, The Genius of the Thames, 1810. Let fancy lead from Shrewsbury Mead, with hazel fringed and copsewood deep, where scarcely seen, through brilliant green, thy infant waters softly creep, to where the wide expanding Nore beholds thee with tumultuous roar. As late as the 18th century there was a well at Shrewsbury Mead, protected by a circular wall some 8 feet in height. Then the wall was demolished or eroded, the well eventually filled in. All that remains as the mark of origin is a small group of stones, like some basin or ring in the ground, in a hollow beneath an ash tree. In some respects these oolite stones, known as stonebrash or corngrate, resemble a cairn or memorial of ancient worship. The mythical properties converge at this place known as Thames Head. The tree protecting the source is an ash that has stood here for approximately 2 centuries. It is a highly significant tree. In the mythology of the Norse people, the roots of the ash tree went down into the lower world. It connected the 3 circles of existence, and was known to be the path of spirits. The giant ash was known as the World Tree, or Yggdrasil. In that mythology there was always a spring or pool beside it. In that mythology, too, a river ran from the tree of life. What could be more appropriate than that it should guard the source of the Thames? But there are other significant associations. The ash tree is sacred to Poseidon, and is the tree dedicated to the power of water. At the source of many rivers are to be found temples, or stones carved with the figures of divinity. Often wooden carvings were placed at the source as votive offerings. A horse stone was erected at Thames Head as a memorial. The same stone is mentioned in a grant of lands given by King Athelstan in the year 931, when it was used as a boundary, or it may have marked a place of sepulture, where some principal person was buried beside the origin of waters. It was later used as a horse block or upping stock, where traveller and horse could pause to refresh themselves with the clear water. It was replaced in the last century by a marble plinth upon which is carved "The Conservation of the River Thames, 1857 to 1974. This stone was placed here to mark the source of the River Thames." Yet there was one problem for the thirsty horse and traveller during certain seasons of the year. Leland states that in a great summer drought there appeareth very little or no water, yet is the stream served with many springs, resorting to one bottom. In the late 18th century, John Boydell remarked in his History of the River Thames, 1796, that "I do not think you will ever find any water in summer-time." The absence of water is still remarked 200 years later. It is one of the mysteries of the Thames. There seems to be no nourishment at the source. For most of the year it remains dry ground. The line of the infant Thames can only be followed by a gentle declivity in the surrounding ground, so that it is possible to walk in the middle of the river without becoming wet. There is, of course, water beneath the surface. A latter-day water diviner has calculated that there is running water at a depth of 5 or 6 feet, with a channel of some 10 inches in width. At times of heavy rain, the spring floods upward. There are photographs, taken in 1960 and 2000, of pools where there had been a well. In the photographs of 1960, small boys are to be seen in canoes beneath the ash tree. There has been a diminution of water, however. The clearance of woods and forests in the region has meant less condensation, but in addition, human artifice has played its part. A steam engine was placed beside the well to pump water for the Thames and Severn Canal, which ran on higher ground close by, and in 1878 a pumping station was erected for the Great Western Railway works at Swindon. Yet the lines and buried streams are still here. The path of the infant river in the declivity is marked by a straggling line of ancient thorns. Along that path there is a group of scattered stones that look very much like the ruins of a stone bridge. About half a mile further down is a large pool or basin, much more likely to be filled with water than Thames Head itself. It is known as Lyd Well, or in translation from Old English, Loud Spring. Lyd Well is the beginning of our pilgrimage beside the Thames. Issuing forth. The tributes. The Thames has many tributaries. There is good reason to honour them. The gods were meant to dance at the confluence of waters. The mingling of the tributary and the main river was deemed to be sacred. The site of entry was a holy place, guarded by the 3 seated goddesses who have been given the name of Matres. There is a significant clustering of cursus sites of presumed Neolithic date around the confluences on the upper Thames. So the meeting of the rivers is an occasion for spiritual ritual. There is one especial god for this purpose. The Celtic god Condatis, who is in some late Roman inscriptions associated with Mars, no doubt in his capacity as a healing power, takes his name from the Gallic epithet waters meet. He is literally the god of the 2 streams, the confluens, and was worshipped as such. It is true that his cult is especially associated with northern Britain, and in particular with the area of the Tyne and the Tees. There is good reason to believe that such an important deity travelled through the island. Many of the principal tributaries of the Thames are now buried. Many are forgotten, many are today unhonoured and unsung. There are London rivers, for example, that have long been forced underneath the ground, where they remain as conduits or as sewers. Some of these buried waters may have found their own courses and become shadow rivers, without a name, silently running within the earth. Spencer honoured the meeting of the Thames with the Medway and with the Lee as a token of cosmic as well as of natural order. In the vast poetical topography of Polyolbion, 1622, Drayton invokes the clear Colne and the lively Leach and the bright Elmlode. Drummond of Hawthornden, in An Hymn of the Fairest Fair, 1623, writes of the stream and of the river as but one self-same essence, nor in aught do differ save in order. So the river can become a metaphor for spiritual grace. In painting, too, Turner was ever alert to the mythical powers of the tributary. One of his most celebrated paintings is entitled Union of the Thames and Isis. The setting is Dorchester Mead, just below the ancient hills of Synodon, and at this place the Thame and the Thames confer. Yet Alexander Pope must carry the palm as the poet of confluence, and in Windsor Forest, 1713, he becomes the Hierophant, chanting holy names. First the famed authors of his ancient name, the winding Isis and the fruitful Thame, the Kennet swift for silver eels renowned, the Loddon slow with verdant alders crowned, Cole, whose dark streams his flowery island lave, and chalky Wey that rolls a milky wave, the blue transparent Vandalis appears, the gulfy Lee his sedgy tresses rears, the sullen mole that hides his diving flood, and silent Darent, stained with Danish blood. And we in turn can call them out from their modest retreats. The Windrush, extravagantly named, rises among the hills of the Cotswolds and passes through Bourton and Witney before joined in the bosom of its parent. Was it so named because it winds among the rushes, or rushes like the wind? By meditating upon its name, Drayton declared that it scours the riverine landscape and hies her fast through the Oxfordian fields. But this was an exaggeration. It is pretty and it is peaceful, except at those points where it surges between the cottages of Bourton-on-the-Water. It is certainly true, however, that the Thames becomes wider and deeper immediately downstream from its confluence with the Windrush. The Kennet mingles with the Thames at Reading. In Polyolbion, Michael Drayton celebrated their confluence. At Reading once arrived, clear Kennet overtakes her lord the stately Thames, which that great flood again, with many signs of joy, doth kindly entertain. It is, in other words, a holy marriage or sacred union, testifying to the life principle of the world. It is an emblem of fertility. One of the early variants of Kennet is Connetio, so that there may be some vestigial reference to the generative organ of the earth goddess. The bridge here is known as the Horseshoe Bridge, the horseshoe being an ancient symbol of fortune. At the mouth of the Kennet there is an ancient burial ground, now known as Broken Bow, which may be a version of Broken Barrow. Objects of metal and of pottery have been dredged up at this confluence of waters, suggesting that offerings were made here. It is also clear from the archaeological evidence, with the finding of an extremely rare hut or shelter beside the river, that the area around the mouth of the Kennet and the Thames harboured a trading station in the Mesolithic period. So this confluence was a commercial as well as a sacred site. The bridge itself is now covered with graffiti. Among them, Christ is coming. The Ock down the river from Abingdon is the sole outlet for the surplus waters of the Vale of the White Horse. It was once the cause of so many floods that it rivalled the Thames. On its banks have been discovered the remains of an Iron Age religious centre, as well as a temple of Romano-Celtic provenance. There was also here a mansio, or lodging-house for pilgrims, and a structure that may either be an amphitheatre or a walled sacred pool. There was also a cemetery sited here. Some of the Roman bodies contained coins in their mouths, so that they might pay the ferryman. The sullen Mole falls into the river just below Hampton Bridge. It is not particularly sullen, and its name seems suspiciously like poetic association with the habits of the subterranean animal. Pope, in fact, borrowed the phrase from Milton, who has the sullen mole that runneth underneath. Milton in turn took the description from Spenser, who wrote, Mole that like a mouseling mole doth make his way still underground till the Thames he overtake. It is an impressive litany of poetic votaries for a small river, and the reference to the underground and to the mole are by no means fanciful. The mole really does disappear and rise again, entering the Thames itself at Molesworth. The River Churn begins its course among the head springs at Seven Springs, which some believe to be the Thames itself, and in the space of 14 miles falls 400 feet until it meets its quietus in the river. It is, or was, a dancing little trout stream until the clear water of the tributary mingles with the turbulent brown river at Cricklade. Just below Shiplake Lock, the Loddon runs into the Thames. Pope describes it as the slow Loddon, but in truth it is not slow at all. It has a swift current, which in previous years supported many watermills. It also has a curious effect of its own. Swimmers of long experience have testified that anyone who swims against its current is invariably affected by sickness and nausea. There is no obvious explanation for this strange phenomenon, but nonetheless it is present. The Wandle discharges itself into the Thames by Battersea, and has one of the strongest currents among all the tributaries of the river. It is the stream from which Wandsworth derives its name. This is the blue transparent Vandalis of Pope's poem, the poet no doubt considering the English name and location to be in need of some Latinate uplift. In fact, the name derives from the Saxon Wendelsworth, or Wendel's settlement. It also has another poem to its credit, though not one that would be allowed into Pope's polite company. Sweet little witch of the Wandle, come to my bosom and fondle. I love thee sincerely, I'll cherish thee dearly, sweet little witch of the Wandle. The name of the Ravensbourne has an exotic origin. It is said that Caesar, while camping with his army near Blackheath, noticed that a raven frequently alighted a short distance away. He conjectured that it came to this place to drink, and after further observation a small, clear spring was found in that place. The spring became known as the Raven's Well. The tributary emerged as the Raven's Bourne. There is a poem of doubtful merit devoted to its progress from a crystal rillet to a flood. The flood itself, being of so deep a nature, later gave its name to Deptford, or Deepford. But it does have a certain historical importance. Its waters refreshed the rebellious followers of Wat Tyler, and at a later date the rebels under Jack Cade. Perkin Warbeck, the pretender to the English throne, met his adherents by the banks of the Ravensbourne. It was here also that in 1497 the Cornish rebels under the command of Lord Audley were hewn to pieces by the captains of Henry VII. No tributary of the Thames has such a history of insurrection and bloodshed. End of Disc 1. Disc 2. The Lee River has been memorialized by Spenser as the wanton Lee that oft doth lose his way, and indeed its course is wandering. It rises near Luton in Bedfordshire, then makes its way to Hertford and to Ware, then passes close by Amwell, touches upon Hoddesdon, Cheshunt, Waltham Abbey, Enfield, Edmonton, Tottenham, Stratford, Walthamstow and Bow, until eventually it finds its surcease at Bow Creek, close to Blackwall. It was once celebrated as a fishing stream, and the fisherman or piscator of Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler frequents the River Lee. But the Lee is now preeminently the river of London's eastern suburbs, and of the industrial parks that have taken the place of the stink industries upon its banks. Leighton is the town upon the Lee. Yet the river has a significant history. The invading Danes sailed up the Lee from Blackwall and erected a fort at Ware. The bridge over the Lee at Stratford or Stratford-le-Bow enjoyed the distinction of being the oldest stone bridge in England, predating London Bridge by 100 years. Waltham Abbey is the last resting place of the last Saxon king of England, buried under the simple inscription of Harold in Felix. The tributary of the Cherwell rises in the ironstone hills of Helledon, and then flows through Northamptonshire and Oxfordshire for 40 miles before reaching the Thames. It augments the volume of the Thames by approximately a third as the river moves towards Iffley. The river Effra is named from the Celtic word Ifrid, or torrent, and in its pristine state it rose near the area now known as Crystal Palace. It flows through Norwood Cemetery, Dulwich, Herne Hill, Brixton and Kennington before entering the Thames at Vauxhall Bridge. There is a curious token of its past significance to be found in the remains of a wooden structure tentatively dated to the Middle Bronze Age, located on the south bank where the Effra joins the river. The remains of the wooden posts can still be seen at low tide, but of the Effra itself there is little sign. It has become what is known as a subterranean river, long since buried by housing and other developments. Parts of the river have been used as sewers since the 17th century, and it has been largely diverted into a storm relief sewer. It can only be entered through the sewers of Effra Road in Brixton. Its powers have departed. The greatest of all the forgotten tributaries, however, must be the Fleet, that still flows into the Thames beneath Blackfriars Bridge. If you travel by boat beneath that bridge, you will see a circular opening through which its waters pour. It is the only visible sign of a buried power. Its name is most likely to derive from the Anglo-Saxon term for a tidal estuary, as in North Fleet. But it is possible that it comes from the fleetness or swiftness of its waters that gathered first among the wells and springs to the north of the city. They came together in the vicinity of Clerkenwell, and the then substantial river ran down Turnmill Street, the etymology of which is clear enough, before widening at Holborn, literally Old Bourne or Old Brook, where a bridge across it was erected. It then entered the valley down to the Thames, the contours of which are still apparent in the canyon of Farringdon Street that descends from Fleet Street to Bridewell. In the medieval period it was in extensive use, most particularly by colliers coming from the northeast of England. One of the streets leading off Farringdon Street is still known as Seacoal Lane. In his survey of London, John Stow writes that, "In times past the course of the water running at London under Oldbourne Bridge into the Thames had been of such breadth and depth that 10 or 12 ships at once, with merchandise, were wont to come to the aforesaid bridge of the Fleet, and some of them to Oldbourne Bridge." More unhappily, it had also been a common depository for the refuse and sewage of Londoners ever since the city was built around it. It was periodically cleansed, but by the end of the 16th century it had become in parts an open sewer, obstructed by refuse of all descriptions, and had acquired a reputation as a noisome and even dangerous place. The inmates of the Fleet prison, largely a jail for debtors, petitioned against the disease and mortality that the vapours of the tributaries seemed to harbour. In 1732 it was bricked in, from Holborn Bridge to Fleet Street, and a market placed on the site. 33 years later it was covered from Fleet Street to its outlet in the Thames. It has the distinction, however, of being celebrated both by Ben Jonson and by Alexander Pope in what might be loosely described as an anti-pastoral tradition. In the poetry of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Thames invokes images of purity and of clarity, but the Fleet was deemed to be its dark shadow. Ben Jonson, in a poem entitled The Voyage Itself, 1610, invokes the filth, stench, noise of the tributary as an essential and elemental part of the city's life. Where the confluence of two rivers was once the occasion for celebration to the gods, the only deities dancing upon these waters are Gorgonian scolds and harpies. Here several ghosts did flit about the shore, of farts but late departed, white, black, blue, green, and in more forms outstarted. It is a torrent of steams and grease, of laxative lettuce, and of murd-urinous load, a wholly rank and miasmal river, which has taken on the more unhappy characteristics of Styx of Acheron, Cocytus, Phlegethon. The epic qualities of the river are here reversed. By the early 18th century the Fleet had become a symbol or epitome of London itself. As a poem in the Tatler of 1710 put it, "Filth of all hues and odours seemed to tell what street they sailed from by their sight and smell." In the Dunciad, 1728, Pope widens and intensifies Jonson's excremental vision with his own description of the impure locale. To where Fleet ditch with disemboguing streams rolls the large tribute of dead dogs to Thames, the king of dykes, than whom no sluice of mud with deeper sable blots the silver flood. It is the metaphorical space for filth and love of dirt, the excremental centre of London's polluted life. In Pope's cloacal vision, all of the cheap versifiers and pamphleteers dive into the quaking mud of the tributary as if they were entering their natural element. The silver Thames has its retinue of nymphs and goddesses, but the Fleet has its mud-nymphs, Nigrina black and Murdermente brown, who suck in their votaries with their foul embrace. These are the real nut-brown maids who have migrated from the woods to the sewers and taken on the hue and savour of their ordurous surroundings. The national myth of the Silver Thames rose above these local inconveniences, so that all the mire and filth were projected upon the river or ditch of the Fleet. It was another service that the tributaries paid to their superior. Beginnings. in the beginning. The history of the Thames is as deep and as dark as that of any sea. The stone matrix of the river was first created some 170 million years ago, when the great oceans of the Jurassic period carried the seeds of the limestone and the clay that later became the substrata of the Thames. In this period, pliosaurs and fish with beaks and teeth swam above the bed which would eventually become the Thames. The Cretaceous, the next period of the Earth's history after the Jurassic, means of the nature of chalk. Over the next 77 million years, the fossils of the oceans laid down the chalk beds of southern England. They are the bases of the riverine landscape. In this period, too, the great continent of Pangaea, all the world, began to break apart, creating the land masses of America and Europe. A vast floodplain lay where southern England now exists. Above London swam elasmosaurs and mosasaurs, the giants of the deep, until they were destroyed in a global cataclysm marked by what is known as the KT boundary. The river first emerges as an observable entity some 30 million years ago, midway through the Cenozoic era in which we still live. The British Isles were connected to the European mainland by a bridge of land, where now the North Sea runs, and the Thames was then a tributary of a much larger river that flowed across Europe. The longest stretch of it is now called the Rhine. From the evidence of fossil remains, it is possible in part to reconstruct the landscape of the earliest Thames. There were palm trees and laurels, vines and citrus trees, as well as oaks and beeches. There were water lilies on the surface of the river, as well as long weeds that drifted through the warm water. There was also a new form of plant. Grass began to grow. In certain respects, it would have been a recognizable tropical scene. Termites and ants, beetles and spiders flourished in the humid atmosphere. There were also turtles and crocodiles in the Thames, as well as lizards that resembled modern iguanas. In the river, too, swam eels and ancestors of the perch and other bony fishes. The Thames then ran on a much higher course than its present incarnation. It stretched from Wales and the Bristol Channel across England until it reached the Vale of Aylesbury. It flowed through St Albans and Chelmsford before passing through Romford and issuing into a great lake somewhere south of Harwich. When the railway line from Romford to Upminster was being built in the 1890s, the ancient and forgotten channel of the old river was discovered, like the fossil of a once-living creature. This lake, close to Harwich and close to the northern end of the landmass linking Europe and the British Isles, eventually spilled over the watershed that divided the present North Sea from the English Channel. It was a great and fast-flowing river, a tropical river, a jungle river, to which the ancestors of the horse and the bison, the rhinoceros and the lemur came to drink. Then the climate began to grow colder. The jungle habitat gave way to temperate forests, to grass plains and prairies. The Thames flowed through all these changes, far beyond the time of human origin. The river still contains shells, sedges, and rushes that belong to prehistory. The climate of the world grew ever colder, and at the time of the first northern glaciation, some 2.8 million years ago, a north polar ice sheet began to creep southward. The earth was now on the threshold of the human. Hominids, or ape-men as they were once known, drank from the river and slept in the trees beside its banks before moving onwards. But the spread of the glaciers had a profound and permanent effect upon the Thames. It was pushed southward, closer and closer to its present course. The ice eventually halted just north of the Chiltern-Berkshire Ridge, and about 250,000 years ago the Thames created what is now known as the Thames Valley. The river had also entered the age of humankind. The first dwellers by the Thames came by land from the areas now known as Central and Western Europe, denizens of the Old Stone Age or Paleolithic era. But this category covers the longest period of human survival in the history of the world, some 3 times longer than the entire life of Homo sapiens on the planet, and 100 times longer than the existence of the British Isles as an island. And even then, the Thames was an ancient river. The first inhabitants survived for 500,000 years, having arrived at some point between 500,000 BC and 450,000 BC, but much is unknown. Of the people themselves and of their relation to the river we understand next to nothing. They are what in German are called Geschichtlos, people without history. The last major glaciation came to an end approximately 12,000 years ago, after an icebound age of 1,000 years. The more temperate climate attracted new settlers, as well as the elk and reindeer for which they hunted. This was the age in which hippos wallowed in Trafalgar Square and elephants roamed down the Strand. In fact, it represents a significant period in the history of the Thames, since from the arrival of Mesolithic settlers in 10,000 BC, there has been an unbroken process of occupation and settlement in the Thames Valley. The new arrivals first crossed by land before the floods united the North Sea and the Channel. There were many different groups and tribes of various identities, but the preponderant element beside the Thames was that of the fair-haired Maglemosians, or marsh people, first discovered in northwestern Europe. They survived in small settlements perched on the gravel banks of the river, living predominantly by hunting and fishing. They manufactured fish hooks and bark floats for their nets. But their signature lay in the manufacture of stone microliths, or small flints used as blades or points for spears. They cut back the birch and the pine to make large clearings, and they domesticated dogs for hunting or defence. The bones of fish and beavers, of pigs and wildcats, of birds and badgers have been found in profusion. They had spears and axes made of bone or antler. They were adept in the carving of wood and the stretching of leather. They made their dwellings, for example, by placing animal hide over a wooden cage of birch saplings. The hearth was in the centre of the hut. It is the pattern of the first houses by the Thames. And they constructed boats, which benefited from advances in the technology of stone tools. The earliest boats of which archaeologists have knowledge were crafted in the Mesolithic period. They were canoes dug out of single tree trunks. The trunks would have been cut and burnt to the requisite size and depth. One found in the river at Shepperton was some 18 feet in length and might have carried 3 or 4 people. The adze marks, where the wood had been shaped and fashioned, are still just discernible. Other boats found on the riverbed of the Thames at Bourne End were more than 25 feet in length, with a beam of almost 3.5 feet. Seats had been carved out of the solid wood. The next settlers arrived in the region of the Thames in approximately 3,500 BC. Their age has become known as that of the Neolithic, and covered almost 2,000 years of human history. In this relatively short period, however, human beings left an enduring presence upon the landscape of the Thames Valley. They came to areas that had already been extensively settled before them, and seemed to have taken up a pattern of farming and woodland clearance. It was the beginning of the farming life that endured, relatively unchanged, until the middle of the 19th century. In fact, the Neolithic field patterns of Maidenhead were not finally erased until the 1960s. The earliest phase of Neolithic occupation in the Thames Valley is marked by steadily changing modes of work and activity. In place of the microlith and the pointed spear are found sickles, polished stone axes, and querns. Pottery appears for the first time. Bows were fashioned from the wood of the yew. The arrows were of wood and tipped with flint. It was the same type of longbow, some 5 foot in height, that was used by the archers at Agincourt. Its survival over thousands of years is another sign of continuity and sheer force of habit as the prime factors in human existence. We should not assume any sudden emergence of new artifacts, but rather a slow evolution that would not even have been noticeable at the time of change. There have been discovered more than 80 Neolithic settlements in the course of the Middle Thames alone, and we can assume that the banks of the river were occupied at various advantageous sites from source to sea. The people lived in huts and congregated in small villages. They grew crops, but more importantly, they reared stock. They grazed pigs in the woodland, oxen and sheep on the grassland, both of which types of land were plentiful by the river. There is very little evidence of Neolithic dwellings themselves, however, only the remains of post holes or ditches as the tokens of human habitation. There are deposits of flint, of course, and the traces of wheat, barley, and beans. In recent years, the piles of a wooden structure have been found beside the river, where Runnymede Bridge now stands, and they have been deciphered as the remnants of a Neolithic wharf on both sides of the bank, which was later superseded by a Bronze Age construction. If the interpretation is correct, then the Thames in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Ages was an important highway for transport and commerce. It is significant, too, that the course of the river was approximately that which survives still. The Sacred Lines. It is difficult to convey the mystery, the otherness, of early humankind. We do not know the purpose of the cursus monuments and causeway enclosures of the Neolithic period, and can only guess at the ritual significance embodied within their shape. The fact that they were placed beside the Thames offers another possible range of meanings. All we can say with any certainty is that these early tribes had a belief in the efficacy of special places, in the enclosure of ground, and invisibility. So they were led, ineluctably, to the river. Aerial photography has, over the past decades, produced ghost images of ancient enclosures close to the Thames, shadow lands of lines and rectangles and circles scarcely visible within the modern terrain. Yet they are there, the sleeping faces of our ancestors still part of the land. Like the giant carvings of the Nazca, they are now best seen from the air. But in the beginning they lent power and sacredness to the area in which they had been constructed. The causewayed enclosures of the Thames region follow a general pattern. They consist of ditches arranged in the broad form of concentric ovals, with spaces or entrances between each segment of ditch and with causeways leading in or out of the ceremonial space. Some have only one ovoid ditch with an internal bank, but others have several concentric circuits. The presumption must be that they were altered and developed over the passage of centuries. The ditches contained animal bones, pottery, and flint in large quantities. More significantly, they also contained human bones. The dead were buried here. They may have been the site of regional or tribal gatherings, and may in some sense have marked out the space or territory claimed by that group. It is also very likely that they possessed other ritualistic or ceremonial functions. They were not used for permanent human settlement, but for occasional or seasonal purposes. They were not defensive fortifications, like the hill forts of the Iron Age, but more open and exposed. They could best be seen by approach from a certain vantage, and so they play their part in the endless celebration and recognition of the earth itself. The river itself acted as a boundary, of course, and that limit may need to have been periodically and ceremonially confirmed. Of the 5 aligned by the Thames, the enclosure at Abingdon is perhaps the most important. It employs the river as one of its boundaries, and is thus in communion with its natural force. The outer circle of Abingdon shows signs of human activity, while the inner area seems to have been used for specific rites or ceremonies. By the causewayed enclosure at Abingdon can be found a number of long oval barrows. These burial mounds were covered in soil and chalk. They would have gleamed white in the landscape. They have been placed in alignment with the causewayed enclosure, and also in alignment with the river itself. There are, in fact, some 25 barrows of varying types in close proximity to the river. They seem to have been chosen for that particular vantage, and no other, close to the waters. They are generally on the site of previous Mesolithic activity, too, which suggests that the same riverine locations have been in employment for many thousands of years. Some of them were built in different sections and at different periods. One of the barrows by Abingdon was built in 5 stages. From the beginning of the enclosure to the end of the burials, the period of development and change lasts some 2,000 years. They were related to the ancestral history of the Thames. The presence of the buried dead at Abingdon and elsewhere suggests another possibility. If the dead were crossing between worlds, then they might be associated with the flowing water. In various mythologies, the dead travel to their new kingdom by way of a river. We come from and return to the water. The long barrows contained mortuary rooms of stone and wood, and in many cases they were decorated with stone floors and portals. From the medieval period they've been called sarsen stones, reputed to have magical qualities. One of the most impressive of them, known to later Saxon settlers as Wayland's Smithy, is in the region of the Upper Thames, but there are others in closer proximity to the river at Dorchester and at Stanton Harcourt, at Drayton and at Benson. They were ancestral places where ties of kinship and continuity could be celebrated. The river itself, like stone, withstood time. This is not just a matter of ancient history. It is of cardinal importance in understanding the power of the river in human memory. If we do not understand its past associations, we will not understand the nature of its presence in the contemporary world. At a slightly later stage of the Neolithic, approximately the period 3600 to 3000 BC, other great monuments were erected beside the Thames. The most extraordinary of them has become known as the cursus. It is essentially a human intervention in the landscape, whereby two parallel ditches with internal banks are carved across the earth. Their ends were sometimes enclosed and sometimes left open. Their length varied from 50 feet to over 5 miles. The valley of the Thames is the most important setting for the construction of the cursus. There are clusters of them at North Stoke and South Stoke and at Drayton. There are cursus monuments at Stadhampton and at Sunning, at Stanwell and at Goring. All of them are close beside the river. None of them is found on the Downs or the Cotswolds. They are, in other words, directly related to the Thames. There is, for example, a very important cursus complex near the source of the river at Lechlade and at Buscott Wick. There is also a series of cursus monuments, barrows, and long enclosures in the area of the river spanned by Abington and Dorchester. In both of these areas, the archaeologists and paleohistorians have surmised intense ritual activity over a period of almost 2,000 years. The Drayton cursus, aligned close beside the Thames, was first constructed in 3600 BC and was employed for early Bronze Age barrows around 2000 and 1800 BC. This is a long period of human history in which the Thames was the centre of ritual or ceremonial observance. Deposits of pottery and flint as well as animal bone have been discovered in the ditches along the lines of the cursus, but their form is as significant as their purpose. They were built in alignment with the river, which in stretches along the cursus route flowed north to south as well as west to east. The cursus imitates its flow. Between Drayton and Abington, the cursus is aligned with the main channel of the river, except where the river itself bends around a ridge of sandstone and flows eastward. Its flow and direction are then adopted or imitated by a long barrow that faces eastward and connects with the end of the cursus itself. It is a form of sacred geometry. The sites of the cursus all seem to be connected one with another, so that the long barrow at Drayton points towards the cursus monuments downriver at Dorchester. The symbolic destination of the cursus is also related to the confluence of tributary and main river. Some monuments are in fact built beside a tributary, such as the Tame by Dorchester, and seem to point towards the mingling of the waters. There are cursus complexes that congregate around the confluence of the River Ock and the River Thames, as well as the rivers Leach and Cole with the Thames. There is also a linear ditch at Lechlade that marks out the confluence of two rivers. People worshipped at the confluence of rivers. It was a place of votive offering. The cursus embodied linear flow. It may indeed have been a representation of the river, a symbol or even drawing of the Thames within the landscape. Just as the ritualized drawings of animals were a way of ensuring a plentiful supply of food, so the cursus may have been considered to be a way of controlling the river. The cursus may also have included some notion of ritual cleansing or purification, so important in later uses of the river. In one pit within the cursus at Drayton South were found 10 human skulls. In another were found the crouched forms of a woman, a child, and a baby. The Dorchester cursus itself crosses a mortuary enclosure. The ritual evidence goes very deep. It may be surmised that the riparian landscape was also a funerary or a mortuary landscape, and that the river was very closely associated with death. The meaning of Tamaza, dark river, is then clarified for later generations. In the area of the cursus, at a later date still, were placed what have become known as henge monuments. These were essentially earthworks enclosed by ditches. On first inspection they resemble mortuary enclosures, but the henges simply mark out an area of the terrain generally located between the cursus and the river. This area might then, at a later date, be characterized by wooden or stone constructions, Stonehenge being, of course, the most celebrated example. There's a celebrated henge monument at Stanton Harcourt in the Upper Thames Valley, known as the Devil's Quoits. The fact that henges exist in the same riverine landscape as the causewayed enclosures and the cursus serves to illustrate one salient point. For many thousands of years, the Thames remained a sacred and highly charged area. The Battle of the Thames. When Julius Caesar first arrived at the Thames during his second invasion of 54 BC, he found the forces of the British tribes drawn up along the northern bank. 'Tis the first instance in recorded history of the Thames being used as a defence. Caesar added that the bank, moreover, was planted with sharp stakes, and others of the same kind were fixed in the bend of the river beneath the water. Yet the Roman army prevailed and crossed the Thames. According to one account, Caesar sent an elephant across the river to frighten the natives. If true, this was the first appearance of an elephant on the Thames since the Pleistocene era. Caesar had formidable enemies. By the close of the Bronze Age, the land about the Thames was marked out and controlled by specific tribes, united under one leader or family of leaders. These had become the chiefdoms of the Iron Age, a name that is taken to span a period of approximately 500 years, from 600 BC to 100 BC. The people of the Iron Age sailed upon the Thames in coracles made out of stretched hide over a frame of young willow branches. These were lighter and more manoeuvrable in the shallows of the river, and a Roman writer from the 6th century BC, Avienus, described them thus: "They have no art of building ships with pine and maple, or the tall fir, as is the custom of most men. Instead, they curve the frame, and this is the wonder of it, and with sewn skins they fit the craft and sail the high seas in a shell of hide." His reference to the high seas, if it is not hyperbole, suggests that these early travellers ventured from the mouth of the Thames into the open water on their way to the European continent. The picture is strengthened by the fact that a number of small kingdoms congregated on and about the Thames. The Catavoloni settled to the north of the Thames, their land stretching to the Cherwell in the west. Its capital was at Verlamion, or, in Latin, Verulamium, near modern St. Albans. Under the leadership of Catavolonus, this tribe, or group, which may have been no more than a band of warriors under a chief, was also responsible for the defeat of the Trinovantes, who occupied the area north of the estuary. To the west, beyond the Cherwell, the Catavoloni were faced by the Dobuni. They had a capital named Bagenden, near Cirencester. To the south of the Thames were the Atrebates, whose capital was called Caleva and is now the site of Silchester. Bagenden and Caleva were linked by a road that crossed the Thames at Cricklade. The evidence of coinage suggests that chieftains on both sides of the river contested relatively small spheres of influence. The evident fact that the river still acted as a boundary and frontier between the tribes, separating, for example, the Atrebates and the Catavoloni, could only have augmented its importance in social and political rituals. The site of Caesar's first battle on the Thames has been endlessly disputed. It was originally believed to have been close to Shepperton, at a place known as Cowie Stakes. Here were found some wooden posts, which, according to the Venerable Bede, writing 700 years later, at this time remaining, were as big as a man's thigh. It was surmised that these were the original stakes planted by the British tribe of the Catavoloni to prevent Caesar and his army from crossing over to the other shore. The stakes are no longer to be found, but one of them was deposited in the British Museum, with the description that this stake was on 16th of October 1777, drawn out of the bottom of the River Thames, in which at least 5/6 of its length was embedded. It stood with several others, which, the water being uncommonly low, were then easily to be seen. About 1/3 of the river's breadth from its south bank, 1/4 of a mile above Walton Bridge. There is some evidence in favour of this supposition. A Roman encampment was established just south of the river by what is now Walton-upon-Thames, and other Roman objects have been found in the neighbouring parish of Oatlands. But the evidence of the wooden stakes may be more prosaic. It has been suggested that they were the piers of a bridge built by an early abbot of Westminster, or the lines of a swimming way for cattle. Other locales along the Thames have also been selected to bear the privilege or burden of expediting Caesar's progress. They have included Chertsey, Wallingford, and Kingston. Brentford has been named, where a column was placed by the bank to mark the supposed crossing. Chelsea is another favoured spot. When in the 1850s a bridge was being constructed there, connecting the Battersea shore with the Chelsea shore, many British and Roman weapons were found together with human bones. So many skulls were retrieved that the location became known as our Celtic Golgotha. But the most likely crossing point was at Westminster. The first of the Roman roads, Watling Street, makes its way from the coast of Kent to Verulamium, some 30 miles north of London. Its point of intersection between north and south is at Westminster. The tide then stopped at Westminster, and the river, flowing south to north along this stretch, spread out across its own floodplain. There are a number of islands, or aits, rising from the water. The banks were low. The river was approximately twice the width of that now running through London and 14 feet shallower. The river bank at Southwark, for example, was some 300 feet further back than it is now. The Thames wove in coils, its broad curves moving through a marshy riverine landscape. On the south side, the grass and osier beds were interrupted by creeks and swamps, while on the north side, the banks were covered with scrub. The river was replenished by many tributary streams and rivers that have long since disappeared or vanished underground. At low tide it moved slowly through banks of clean gravel and sand. Downriver from Westminster, dotted among the waters, there were numerous islands that were submerged at high tide. It seems likely that at times of more favourable climate, the typical roundhouse dwellings of the Britons were built upon these islands. There were also fluctuations in the river level that can be measured in historical time. Throughout the Roman period, for example, the level of the river fell, only to be restored in subsequent centuries. Much of the Roman waterfront is thus irrecoverably lost within the rising waters. Caesar himself has left a significant account of the raids and fighting during his invasion. The Britons engaged with his forces in sporadic raiding parties, so that one squadron relieved another, and our men, who had been contending against those who were exhausted, suddenly found themselves engaged with a fresh body who had taken their place. He also remarks that his native enemies were clad with skins. All the Britons stain themselves with woad, which gives a blue colour and imparts a ferocious aspect in battle. Quantities of woad, or Isatis tinctoria, can still be found growing near the Thames. Some 10 years later, in AD 43, another invasion force of the Romans made use of the river. According to the classical historian Dion Cassius, the British forces were defeated by the Roman legions somewhere along the course of the Medway. After this conflict, the remnant of the British forces retreated to a point where the Thames empties into the ocean and at flood time forms a lake. The area of the lake is now deeply obscured, the Thames having risen approximately 15 feet since the events here related, but the most likely site seems to be that of Lower Hope Point in the present estuary. The terrain of one of the most important battles in English history is irrecoverable. Yet the stage was now set for the arrival of the Emperor Claudius. He joined the legions that were waiting for him by the Thames, and crossing the river, defeated the British tribes on the northern shore before marching upon the enemy capital of Colchester. Claudius remained in Britain for just 16 days, but his mastery of the Thames ensured his mastery of the region itself. It was a signal victory that emphasizes the central importance of the river in British history. At a later date there seems to have been more resistance further upriver, and there are reports of battles at Cricklade and at Thames Head, but the evidence is meagre. It is true, however, that the progress of Romanization was always less evident in the upper reaches of the Thames. So Caesar's invasions were followed by the more settled occupation of Claudian legions, and within 100 years there emerged a group of Romano-British farmers living close to the Thames and its tributaries. There were settlements along the river from source to sea, from Cricklade to Tilbury, and there were many villas and extensive estates to the north of the Thames near the Roman towns of Cirencester and Dorchester. It has been estimated that along the length of the Thames there were approximately 600 villas that may have been owned by Roman veterans or by prosperous Romanized natives. Whatever the forms of ownership and tenure, it was a period of general affluence for the Thames region. On the muddy foreshore of the Thames by East Tilbury were discovered the relics of 4 large Romano-British huts with walls of wattle and conical tiled roofs. In the immediate vicinity were large quantities of pottery, and since no kiln was found, it has been concluded that this was some kind of warehouse or storage centre for native ware. The huts were also beside a path which seemed once to lead down to a ferry, so this was also a crossing point. When these basic huts are compared to the villas beside the Thames, complete with bathhouses and underfloor heating, it is possible to imagine a Thames Valley society of landowners and serfs. It was a society that would persist in one form or another for many hundreds of years. The site of the huts and the ferry has now disappeared beneath the mud of the tidal Thames. And then, of course, it is assumed that the Romans created London. It is much more likely, however, that there was already some form of British settlement here. One of the possible derivations of London is Llyn Din, the British for the hill by the pool. But by general agreement, the Romans were the first people fully to exploit the natural resources of the area. The original slow and sluggish crossing point at Westminster was not at all suitable as a port, and so the Romans chose a stretch along the river that was adequately defended, which could provide a harbour and which was well served by the tides. Romans had a very different vision of the river. It was a line of power, both military and commercial, part of the linear consciousness of the empire. The river had not lost its power of association with the gods, hence the number of Roman relics found within its waters, but it had lost its primeval sacredness. It was often the case, for example, that Roman roads would run straight through circular barrows and henges as a way of erasing their mythic power. The Romans built the first timber bridge across the Thames in approximately AD 52, with a permanent bridge being constructed at the turn of the 1st century. In the 4th century, London's walls were extended to defend the riverside itself. The nature of the Thames had changed. It needed to be tamed and protected. The river served its primary commercial function very well since London was described by the Roman historian Tacitus just 18 years after the Claudian invasion as though undistinguished by the name of a colony, much frequented by a number of merchants and trading vessels. From this early date, the fortunes of the city were irretrievably tied to the presence of the tidal river. Like all great cities of ancient lineage, London was the creation of a river. And so a bustling port emerged along what had been before gravel banks and marshy inlets. The area of Southwark was also used for quays and warehouses. As the level of the river dropped, so the Romans were forced to build out further in order to maintain all the facilities of a port. Some relics of this commerce have been found in the Thames. A flat-bottomed barge was discovered by Blackfriars Bridge in 1962. Part of its cargo was a consignment of ragstone to be employed in the building of the Roman city. In 1918, the remains of a Roman cargo ship were found in some excavations by the bank of the river near Westminster Bridge. Such was the excitement that the timbers were carried on an especially built wagon in procession to the Museum of London. The working life of the ancient city has also been recovered from the Thames, with numerous finds of nails and needles and knives, hairpins and oil lamps and assorted pottery. From Roman times, too, we can date the beginning of the unhealthiness of the Thames. Wooden sewage pipes running down into the water have been found from a Roman edifice by the bank at Cannon Street. In the history of the river there is a continuous association between the progress of commerce and the progressive fouling of the waters. Yet, of course, the Thames was still a major source of food. A manufactory of fish sauce, or garum, in Roman London has provided evidence of the herring, sprat, and sand eel that were taken from the river. When the Roman legions withdrew from London in the early 5th century, there was no sudden collapse of the civilization that they had helped to create. The natives and the settlers were now, after 350 years, part of the same land. Their families had grown up beside the Thames, and that land was still productive, allowing for self-sufficient agriculture. It is significant that many of the Thames villages still in existence at the beginning of the 21st century were first settled before AD 500. These villages are often to be found beside Roman tracks or crossings and within the vicinity of Romano-British buildings. There was no crisis of survival, and no gap in the historical record. One section of the Thames estuary has always been known as the Saxon Shore. It was once generally believed that it was named after fortifications against Saxon invaders, but it is much more likely to have been called the Saxon Shore because the Saxons were settled here. The first Saxons from the North Sea coast of Germany may have come to the region peaceably as traders, merchants, and eventually as settlers. By the 6th century, 100 years after the departure of the Romans, the East Saxons had colonized the territory north of the Thames in approximately the area now called Essex. The Middle Saxons inhabited Middlesex, while south of the river, the West Saxons and South Saxons were eventually united in the kingdom of Wessex. Before Wessex was formed, there was a loose alliance of tribes or kinship groups in the area of the Upper Thames. They were known as the Gewissa, or the Trusty Ones. The river remained an important source of power and of sovereignty. There was a 7th-century palace at Old Windsor, and Kingston was the site for the coronation of no less than 7 Saxon kings. The chapel of St. Mary in that town was once considered to be the place of coronation, and the 17th-century antiquarian John Aubrey noticed there portraits of Athelstan, Edred, Edwy, Edward the Martyr, and Ethelred. There was another palace of the 7th century close to the river at Sutton Courtenay. Religious and military power were not necessarily incompatible, and in 635 the first Bishop of Wessex was granted a Roman fort at Dorchester-on-Thames as the headquarters of his see. There were Saxon settlements along the entire length of the Thames that survive still. Place names such as Sonning, Reading, Barking, and Goring are Anglo-Saxon in origin. Teddington is derived from the name of a tribal leader known as Tudor. Petersham and Twickenham denote the Saxon presence of hams or enclosures that lie in the bend of the river. There are Saxon names on the estuary such as Fobbing, Mucking, and Thurrock. Kemble is the modern version of the Saxon Carmela. Terms such as weir and eight, still in use, are derived from the Anglo-Saxon. The Saxons seem thoroughly to have appropriated the river, to the extent that it still bears a Saxon identity. The river also acted as a boundary between Wessex and Mercia, contested and violated for many centuries. The monastery at Cookham on the bank of the river changed hands several times. Wessex is known in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the kingdom south of the Thames, Suthen Temesi. It had been agreed, according to the account in the Chronicle, that henceforth the river should divide their kingdoms, Mercia from Wessex, and that their kinsmen of all generations to come should keep it so. But the continuing of sporadic battles between Wessex and Mercia meant that by 755 the river was still a trouble and not a joy, as lesser rivers are. Also are greater rivers a joy sometimes. At a later date, a great battle between the two kingdoms was fought at Benson on the Thames, in which Wessex was forced to withdraw to its old area south of the river. The river also became an important trade route from the southeastern part of the country to the central and southern regions. It was a means of communication for otherwise disparate communities. The principal market was, of course, London itself. In the 7th century, the Saxons created Lundenwic, a little to the west of the Roman city, which quickly became an important port with vital trade links to continental Europe. It was primarily a settlement of East Saxons, who maintained a commercial connection with the valleys of the Elbe and the Rhine. The river brought in imports of timber and resin, and took out corn and wool. By the 10th century, there are records of the tolls charged at Billingsgate, with vessels paying 4d for lying at the wharf. Other quays or hithes were constructed along the river bank, most of them in the protection of the wall that had been built to shield London from the invaders of the river. Then, in 893, a great Danish army landed at the estuary and began a course of plunder towards London. They came with their women and children and were intending to stay. It was truly an invasion of the Thames. The Danes concentrated on the Thames because they understood that control of the river would result in control of the surrounding country. It also offered a convenient means of access to various enemies scattered in adjacent territories. The Danes could attack both Mercia and Wessex from their river haven. But the river also left them open to counterattack, and in 1895, according to the Chronicle, the men of London fetched the Danish ships, and all they could not lead away they broke up, and all that were worthy of capture they brought into the port of London. There were many attacks in succeeding decades that used the river as their point of entry. In 1010, Thorkel the Tall sailed up the Thames and put Oxford to the flame. 4 years later, Olaf, King of Norway, sailed up the river and laid cables around the piles of London Bridge. He attached the cables to his ships and, sailing away, pulled the bridge down. It is this incident that lies behind the children's rhyme, London Bridge is falling down. The Danish king Knut, or Canute, became the undisputed king of England from 1016 to 1035 precisely because he had gained control of the Thames. But he was aware of the limits of his power, According to a Norman poem, he illustrated his inability to control the tides as a lesson to his courtiers on the futility of earthly rule, not on the Sussex coast, but sitting on his throne by the Thames. It was the tidal river at Westminster that provided the salutary example, since it was here that Canute erected his royal palace. "There is but one king," he is supposed to have said, "he whom heaven and earth and sea obey." The Thames had become a great lesson in divine power. Throughout these centuries of conquest and assimilation, the river played a formative role. According to the monastic chronicler of the 6th century, Gildas, the Thames was always the guardian river, or the river of boundaries. It represented border country, the liminal area between two jurisdictions, and so became a significant site for meetings and conferences and negotiations between different parties. It was also employed for religious synods. The same places, such as Kingston and Dorney, would be used intermittently over a number of years and perhaps over a number of centuries. The most famous encounter at Runnymede, when Magna Carta was agreed, may only have been one of many such conferences that employed this sacred, or at least elected, place. As a dividing line, the river was guarded by spirits. Nymphs, goddesses, gods, fairies and demons have all been invoked at different times as its protectors. If you trespassed across a boundary, you were offending the water spirits more than the owner of the adjoining land. But then the Thames has also become the home of saints. Holy River. A Thames villager of the 1770s left a confession of murder after his own death, in which he claimed that the purifying waters of the river at Buscott must slake me of my crime. In one of the Vedic Puranas, it is declared that all the rivers are sacred, all flow towards the sea, all are like mothers to the world, all purge away sin. The Thames itself has always been considered holy, an aspect of the peace that passes all understanding. From the earliest stages of human life, rivers themselves have been deemed to be sacred. The ancient Persians considered it blasphemous to pollute them. The Ganges has been treated as a god. Hindus have seen in the icicles of the Himalayan cavern where the Ganges rises the flowing hair of the god Shiva. The Abyssinians worshipped the Nile as a divinity. The Egyptians venerated the annual rise of the Nile with burnt offerings, sacrifices, and rituals of fire. They saw the river in the form of the god Hapi. The twin rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were venerated as the home of dragons. It was a recognition of the fact that the waters could be destructive as well as fruitful. In the cultures of Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, magicians and soothsayers would practice their arts by the rivers. In the aboriginal cultures of Australasia, the dream-time tracks of the ceremonies followed the courses of the rivers. The Thessalians worshipped the Peneus River on account of its beauty. The Scythians revered the Danube for its magnitude. The Aetolians venerated the Achelous for its ancientness. It is conjectured that in England the Druids worshipped the rivers that flowed from west to east, one of which, of course, is the Thames itself. That is why the 6th century historian of England, Gildas, spoke of the local rivers as an abomination and destruction to men, and to which the blind people paid divine honour. The later chronicler, Geoffrey of Monmouth, also placed the Thames in the context of sacred events. It was to the river that Brutus, grandson of Aeneas, came to found Troia Nova. An altar dedicated to Jupiter Optimus was found on the banks of the Thames at Little Wittenham, and the ritual carving of a goddess was excavated by Bablock Hythe. Close by the remains of Reading Abbey lies Hallowed Brook. The spiritual presence of the river has been attested in a number of different ways. The 20th century painter Stanley Spencer saw in the river intimations of the Scriptures. In particular, he portrayed Christ preaching from a boat moored by the river bank. This was beside his local village of Cookham, in which place his images are bathed in the light of eternity. In Salve Deux, Rex Judeorum, Emilia Lania, a poet of the 16th century, addressed "Sweet Cookham, where I first obtained grace, from that grace, where perfect grace remained." It was for her the paradise of Cookham. In 1966, a Polish émigré, Alexander Wozniak, proposed to walk on the Thames from Cricklade to London in order to celebrate 1,000 years of Christianity in his native country. For this venture he constructed ski-noos, a hybrid of water skis and canoes with which he reached Westminster Pier 7 days later. One of the great celebrators of the river, Kenneth Grahame, for a moment abandoned the childlike animal life of the Thames in The Wind in the Willows in order to evoke the holiness of the river's presence. In a chapter entitled The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, he describes how mole and rat approach an island in the middle of the river with solemn expectation. When they land upon this ait, Rat whispers, "This is the place of my song dream, the place the music played to me. Here, in this holy place, here, if anywhere, surely we shall find him." He is the ancient deity of the river, the pagan divinity who is part Pan and part Shiva and part Hapi, the quintessential river god, to whom the two animals, crouching to the earth, bowed their heads and did worship. Yet there are some who would claim that these gods and goddesses are expressions of the natural divinity of water. The river represents the concept of divine intervention in nature. The holy waters support life and promote fertility as well as destruction. In the 46th Psalm it is revealed that there is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. Thus the deity of the river adopts a fluid shape. He is Proteus as well as Pan. There are 4 gilded statues of the Buddha overlooking the river from their prominence in Battersea Park. In 2004, a Hindu shrine was found beside the Thames near Chelsea Bridge, complete with candles and symbols of brass. Both Sikhs and Hindus are now pursuing a campaign for legislation that would allow them to scatter the ashes of their dead into the river. On the first morning of the Jewish New Year, a company of Jews used to meet on a quay by the north bank of the Thames against the Custom House and offer up prayers in remembrance of their captivity. The ancient river can be seen as an ancestral home for the faiths of all. The Knights Templar settled by the Thames. All trace of them has now disappeared, but they have left behind the tokens of their presence in the names of Temple Lock, Temple House, Temple Combe, and Temple Mills along the river. The original crossing at Marlow, where a bridge now stands, can be attributed to the Knights Templar of Bisham. In Ian Sinclair's Fantasy of the Thames, Downriver, 1991, he compares the fortifications of the Thames barrier to helmeted Templars flashing with signals, arrows, red crosses, warnings. Pilgrims crossed the Thames as part of their journey towards salvation, or at least towards the remission of sin. There was a pilgrim pathway from Waltham Cross to Canterbury that traversed the uninhabited marshes of the Isle of Dogs. There was a pilgrim chapel, too, by the river there, where the devout could pray for a successful crossing. It is shown on an early 18th century map with nothing beside it but a few windmills. There was another ancient causeway near the parish of Higham in the estuary from which the pilgrims of Essex could make their way to Becket's shrine. Other river crossings for the pilgrims of medieval England are marked by the number of badges or tokens that have been found in deposits along the foreshore. There is a church on the riverbank at St. Clement's Reach, near West Thurrock, which is still called the Pilgrim Church. It retains a reputation, albeit of a more secular nature. It is one of the churches used in the successful film 4 Weddings and a Funeral. The film is apposite in another sense, since river churches have always been a favourite venue for weddings. In the spring and summer months there is a plethora of such ceremonies, with a clear connection to the fertility magic associated with the Thames. It is the custom for the newly married couple to cross the bridge, if one exists, and to be photographed on the bank opposite the church. It is an emblem of crossing between worlds, one of the many rites of passage with which the river is identified. To be baptized in the river is also to be reborn, to have crossed the threshold into a new life. On the humpbacked stone bridge at Radcott, the oldest on the Thames, there are the remains of a stone font that was employed for the baptismal rite. There is, in Cricklade, a traditional place beside a small plank bridge known as Hatchett's Ford, or more prosaically, Plank Bridge, where full immersion baptisms were still taking place at the beginning of the 20th century. It is one of the most ancient rituals of the Thames. There were baptisms by the Isle of Sheppey, close to the 7th century abbey established by Queen Sexburga. Hermits have found sanctuary beside the river. There was a medieval hermitage known as the Swan's Nest in the riverside area of Wapping. It was inhabited by John Ingram from 1371 to 1380. There was a recluse known as Honora, who lived immured in a cell beside the riverside church of St. Mary in Iffley. There was, within living memory, a hermit in the woods by the river at Hambledon, known only as Judgment Jack. The river offers seclusion and the stilling of human voices. Nymphs have always been part of the life of the Thames. There are still memorials of them everywhere. By an old riverside path in Twickenham, just past Eel Pie Island, there are stone images of 7 nymphs lying upon some rocks. In the pediment of Somerset House by the river reclines a nymph brandishing a trident. In his Paean to the Thames, in Windsor Forest, 1713, Alexander Pope declares to the river that nor all his stars a brighter lustre show than the fair nymphs that gild thy shore below. The nymph was popularly believed to be a healer and a guide to travellers, a caretaker of youth and a source of knowledge. She embodied the natural magic of the river. Of all the local deities, the nymph was the one most revered. In the classical world, for example, almost every spring or fountain had a small altar or shrine. The nymphs were powerful and benevolent spirits, able to diffuse wealth and fertility over the riverine regions that they occupied. In the 16th century, John Dickinson in Arisbus, Euphues amidst his slumbers, 1594, celebrated lovely Thamesis, fairest of fair Nereids, the fair nymphs keeping time with the billowing of her crystal waves, carrying to the ocean with her ebb. When Elizabeth I or James I went on royal progress through the riparian counties, the sovereign was generally presented with a mask of the nymph of the place. In 1660, the Lord Mayor's show along the Thames contained 4 virgins clothed in white loose garments and their brows circled with sage, representing the nymphs that frequent rivers. It was an enduring popular superstition that did not really fade until the middle of the 19th century. But as T.S. Eliot lamented in The Waste Land, 1922, the nymphs are departed. It is the mark of a great transition in which the natural religion of the world has been abandoned. There were many rituals concerned with the river. In the 10th century, the monks of Abingdon put a sheaf of corn and a lighted taper on the boss of a shield. Then they launched the shield into the Thames, where it was supposed to trace the contours of disputed land. At Eton, by the river, a group of German travellers were surprised in 1598 by country folk parading a sheaf crowned with flowers. In that same century, on the 1st of May, the scholars of Oxford assembled by a bridge over the river and chanted a Latin hymn in honour of Mary, whereupon a lamb was roasted and fed to the assembled crowd. In the parish of Cumnor, in a ceremony known as the perambulation circuit, the sum of 6 shillings and 8pence was brought to the local vicar by the Thames ferryman. He carried the money in a basin with a clean napkin, and after the vicar had fished for the coins and dried his fingers, he distributed the shillings and pence to the young people who came within his reach. The origin of this custom is quite obscure. In Rogation Week, the same villagers of Cumnor on the Thames used to cross in the ferry to the other side, and there lay hold upon the twigs and reeds that grew by the bank. This may be some ceremony of possession, as in the beating of the bounds, but it is also intimately linked to the veneration of the genius Loki. A similar rite of possession was conducted around London Stone. This is not the stone now deposited in Cannon Street as the guardian spirit of London, but that established just upriver from the bridge at Staines. It marked the upper limit of the jurisdiction of the City of London over the waters of the Thames, and was first erected in 1280. The ceremony here included a ritual walk around the stone and the characteristic scattering of coin to the crowd. But in homage to the egalitarian temper of the Thames, the waterman was supposed to bump any sheriffs or aldermen who attended the ceremony. There is now a replica of the stone, hidden by trees, upon the northern bank. In 2001, some candles and a sheet of paper were found by the banks of the Thames. The name of a man was written upon the paper 3 times and inscribed upon the candles. The man was located and confirmed that these were the remnants of a prayer service designed to protect him from harm. There are many river omens and superstitions, and the mariners and fishermen of the Thames had superstitions different from those of the land. A black cat upon a ship was deemed to be the omen of a storm. The spotting of a hare near the boat was enough to call off a coming voyage. Fishermen also refused to carry white stones among their ballast, and a holed stone signified a holed net. If a monkfish was caught, it was nailed to the mast as a means of averting misfortune. This may relate to the superstition that a priest or monk should never be allowed on board a Thames vessel. Until quite recent times, the backbone and skeleton of the herring were thrown back into the river after the flesh had been eaten, as a tribute to King Herring. One of the most familiar superstitions connected to the Thames, however, was also one of the oldest. Loaves were pitched into the water as a tribute to the local water goddess. If they sank, she had accepted them and would renew her blessings. But if they continued to float, the offerings had been rejected. Saints of the River. St. Birinus has long been venerated as the first and principal saint of the Thames. In the 7th century he converted the first Saxons to Christianity by baptizing them in the river at places such as Somerford Keynes, Taplow, Ewan, Poole Keynes, and Kemble. He baptized King Cyngils of Wessex in the Thames at Dorchester. In the same stretch of river, and the following year he baptized the king's son. The river had become his fountain of grace. In the early 7th century he is supposed to have established a church by the river at Hurley, on a previously pagan site of worship, as well as the Church of the Holy Trinity at Cookham. Bapsy Pool at Taplow, associated with the baptismal ministry of Birinus, is still to be found in the grounds of Taplow Court. As a missionary bishop, he established his see by the Thames at Dorchester. He is buried in the abbey there, and his shrine became a place of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. The shrine still survives in the church, to be visited by modern Thames pilgrims. St. Alphege is the patron saint of Greenwich. He was Archbishop of Canterbury at the beginning of the 11th century, when he was abducted from the cathedral there by a detachment of Danish invaders and taken to their court by the river at Greenwich. Here he was murdered by his captors, beaten to death with the bones of oxen, and the present church of St. Alphege was erected by Nicholas Hawksmoor on the site of his martyrdom. There is every reason to suppose that shrines have been placed on this spot ever since his death in 1012. St. Alban parted the waters of the Thames in front of the blasphemers who murdered him. On his way to execution, on the 20th of June, 304, he was obliged to cross the river. There, according to the Venerable Bede, he saw a multitude of both sexes, and of every age and rank, assembled to attend the blessed confessor and martyr, and these so crowded the bridge that he could not pass over that evening. Then St. Alban, urged by an ardent desire to accomplish his martyrdom, drew near to the stream, and the channel was dried up, making a way for him to pass over. In his 6th century chronicle De Excidio Britanniae, Gildas reported that with 1,000 others, he, Alban, opened a path across the noble river Thames, whose waters stood abrupt like precipices on either side. As a result of fervent prayer, he opened up an unknown route across the channel. Gildas's analogy here is with the River Jordan in the Holy Land. St. Chad is supposed to have given his name to Chadwell St. Mary on the Thames estuary in the 7th century, and there is a well here in which he is believed to have baptized the East Saxons to the Christian faith. St. Erkenwald founded the abbeys of Barking and of Chertsey in the 7th century, and so can be considered a tutelary spirit of the Thames. And then there is St. Edmund, born by the river in Abingdon, who was one day wandering in the water meadows beside the Thames when he was vouchsafed a vision. According to Caxton's Golden Legend, 1483, suddenly there appeared to fore him a fair child in white clothing, which said, "Hail, fellow that goest alone." But he is perhaps not so much a saint of the river as the saint of solitary walkers, who find by the moving water peace or solace and quiet dreaming. End of Disc 2. Disc 3. There have, of course, been many female saints intimately associated with the river. St. Friderswide is perhaps the most celebrated. In the late 7th century she fled to the Thames with her 2 sisters in order to escape the advances of Algar, an Anglo-Saxon prince, and on the Thames near Oxford they found a youth of heavenly appearance, clothed in dazzling white, who seated them in a boat, and within an hour landed them 10 miles downstream at Abingdon. At Abingdon, Friderswide performed a miracle, and her presence being known, she sailed upstream to Binsey, where she erected a chapel constructed of wallins and rough-hewn timber by the Thames. Here, through the medium of prayer, she found a stream of water that in succeeding generations became a healing well. But her principal connection is with Oxford, of which city she remains the divine patroness. She established a monastery in that place, which was at a later date transmogrified by Cardinal Wolsey into Christ Church College. She died at Binsey in AD 740, and her shrine is still to be seen in the Cathedral of Christ Church. Her most celebrated maxim, according to legend, is that whatever is not God is nothing. That part of the Kentish bank known as the Hoe was under the special care and protection of St. Werburg, daughter of Wulfhere, King of Mercia. Little is known of this blessed lady except for the fact that she had an aversion to geese. The abbey at Reading once contained a sacred relic believed to be the hand of James the Apostle. The bones of a human hand were, in fact, found in the ruins of the abbey in the late 18th century, and somehow or other they migrated to another church by the river, St. Peter's in Marlow. The Thames has always attracted votive objects. It is suggestive to note, however, that the skeletal cadaver of St. James, buried in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, lacks its left hand. At the Priory of Caversham, too, many relics were venerated, among them the spearhead that pierced the side of Jesus upon the cross. With this litany of attendant saints and relics, it is not at all surprising that the Thames is a river of churches. Their history often begins with the wooden constructions of Saxon origin, but almost all of the churches in the Thames Valley had taken their present form by the 11th century. It represents a remarkable story of continuity. There are some very ancient foundations, indeed, still manifest in the long and narrow churches by the river. The presence of the Thames is always sensed within them, if for no other reason than that many of them are built as close to the river as the stonemasons and labourers could possibly manage. The churches of Castle Eaton and Kempsford, near the source of the river, are almost in the waters. The church of St. Mary Magdalene at Boveney, meaning the place above the island, is so close to the river that it can only be reached by a footpath. It was said originally to have been a chapel upon a wharf. It is now being sponsored by the Friends of Friendless Churches. The Church of All Saints at Bisham stands upon the river bank. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin stands beside the bridge at Henley, raised upon an embankment so that it can look over the waters. The Church of St. Peter at Caversham is similarly built upon a steep bank beside the river. The churches of Streatley and Goring face each other across the Thames. There is some deep connection between worship and the crossing of the water. The Church of All Saints at Marlow, built upon a site dating back to at least the 12th century, is beside the bridge there. The Church of St. Leonard at Wallingford is close beside the river and the bridge. The Church of St. Mary at Hurley was situated by an important ford, recorded as early as the 7th century. It is likely, however, that there was a significant crossing here in prehistoric times. The Church of St. Andrew in Sunning stands beside a bridge. The riverside village of Sunning itself was also the site for the palace of the bishops of Salisbury, dating back to the 10th century. Once again, the association between the Thames and religious power is maintained. To visit these churches now is to be made aware of solemnity and old time. There is a palpable stillness within them, a perpetual harbouring of worship. In many of them are the relics of very different styles, from the 9th to the 19th centuries, and this heterogeneity of periods is typical of the Thames churches. It is a place where time itself is mingled and confused. From a certain vantage, in the meadows outside Lechlade, the spire of the Church of St. Lawrence seems in fact to rise from the water and become an expression of it. Hail, Holy River, Mother of Grace. There is a Church of St. Mary the Virgin at Whitchurch-on-Thames. There is a Church of St. Mary in Reading, founded by St. Birinus in the early years of the 7th century. In Wargrave there is a Church of St. Mary, also of great antiquity. There is an ancient church of St. Mary in Cricklade. On its north wall was a half-length fresco of the Virgin and Child. The original dedication of the Church of St. Lawrence in Lechlade was to St. Mary. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin at Castle Eaton had a fresco of the Virgin. The most perfect Norman church in the country is that of St. Mary the Virgin, perched above the river at Iffley. The parish church of Putney is dedicated to St. Mary the Virgin, as is the church at Bampton. The church of St. Mary the Virgin at Long Wittenham is erected at one end of the village. Among the warehouses of Rotherhithe, beside the Thames, still stands the church of St. Mary the Virgin. The church in the marketplace at Wallingford is known as St. Mary the More, in distinction to the one of St. Mary the Less that was united with St. Peter in the 14th century. The ancient church of St. Mary at Icey, or Island in the River, was built on the summit of the hill. It was demolished in the last century for absence of worshippers. There was on the island of Sheppey at the mouth of the Thames an abbey dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. The Abbey Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary still stands there, at the highest point of the island. The Church of St. Mary at Cholsey, or Choles Island, was originally built upon a dry place in a marshy area. There may have been some sanctity associated with these refuges from the river. In the centre of the island, still known as the Isle of Dogs, there was formerly a small chapel dedicated to St. Mary, founded for the purpose of offering up masses for the souls of mariners. It has long gone. London's Church of St. Mary at Hill was named because of its position on a steep bank above Billingsgate. St. Mary le Strand stands on an eminence where the Strand and Fleet Street now meet. The river was, of course, much closer to it at the time of its erection than it is now in its present embanked state. John Stowe records that on the marshy bank opposite Greenwich stood the remains of a chapel built of stone that had been dedicated to St. Mary. It seems to have been connected with the monastery of St. Mary of Graces that had stood near the Tower of London. At Kempsford, Hornscross, Gravesend, Benfleet, Corringham, Datchet, Hambledon and Teddington are parish churches dedicated to St. Mary. The Church of St. Mary at Sunbury lies on the site of a prehistoric settlement. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin at Purley is close to that point on the river where a ferry once crossed to Maple Durham. The Church of St. Mary at Streatley is also beside the river, as is the Church of St. Mary at North Stoke. The ferry that ran between Cookham and Cliveden was known as My Lady Ferry. The University Church of Oxford in the High Street is also that of St. Mary the Virgin. The parish church of Mortlake is dedicated to St. Mary, as are those of Hampton and of Barnes and of Twickenham, of Walton-upon-Thames and of Thame. There is some dispute whether the parish church of Langford near Kelmscott is dedicated to St. Mary or St. Matthew, but as Fred Thacker wrote in The Stripling Thames, Mary was certainly a very favourite dedication amongst these churches. The church of Abingdon Abbey was originally dedicated to St. Mary the Virgin, but in the 15th century it was rededicated to All Saints. The church of North Stifford is named in honour of the Virgin. So is the church of Chadwell. These are little-known places, but they are part of a broad sweep of faith. The Church of St. Mary at Buscott is beside the river and contains stained-glass windows designed by Edward Burne-Jones. The little church by the river at Inglesham has a carving of the Virgin and Child dated to the early 11th century on its south wall. The sculpted forms are taken from a Byzantine model. St. Mary's at Staines is erected upon the site of a 7th century church. The church of Lambeth is dedicated to St. Mary. A little further along the river, at Battersea, also stands the Church of St. Mary. The abbey at Aynsham, of which now only a few stones remain, was named in honour of the Virgin. The monastery at Hurley was dedicated to the Virgin and was known as Lady Place. Grace's Alley, by Well-Close Square in the East End, is the only memorial to the Cistercian abbey of St. Mary of Graces that stood by the river. The nunnery at Godstow was dedicated in honour of the Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist. The priory at Bisham was dedicated to Mary. The Bridgetine Abbey at Sion was dedicated to the Virgin as well as to St. Bridget herself. Eton School, beside the river, was founded in the 15th century as the College of the Blessed Mary of Eton beside Windsor. The Cathedral of Southwark was originally known as St. Mary Overy, or St. Mary over the river. From the downstream parapet of the bridge at Radcott, a niche still projects. It once supported an image of the Virgin that was destroyed during the Civil War. One arch of the medieval London Bridge was known as Mary Lock. In the same period, the records refer to the image of Our Lady on the bridge, and in the church beside the bridge, St. Magnus, a perpetual chantry was set up in honour of the Virgin, where Salve Regina was sung every evening. The ancient abbey at Barking harboured the Lady Chapel of Birking Church in London, which became the destination of Marian pilgrims. A statue of the Virgin here was reputed to possess miraculous powers. At Caversham there stands Our Lady of Caversham Chapel, the only relic of a great shrine to the Virgin where was erected a jewel-encrusted image of Mary, again supposed to contain sacred powers to which pilgrims travelled from all over the country. When Dr. London, an agent of the Crown, came to this holy place at the time of dissolution, he reported in apparent disgust that even at my being there come in not so few as a dozen with images of wax. When the Saxon kings were crowned at Kingston, the ceremony was conducted in the chapel of St. Mary. It was in this chapel that John Aubrey, in his Antiquities of the County of Surrey, 1718, recorded the presence of 5 pictures of the Saxon monarchs. In the grounds of Culham Court, by the river, is a copy of Elizabeth Frink's statue known as Striding Madonna. This litany of names and places suggests that there is more than coincidence at work in the association of the Virgin and the Thames. From the churches of the Upper Thames to the churches of the estuary, the dedication to St. Mary far surpasses all others. It might in fact be claimed that the Thames is Mary's river. From the 7th to the 14th centuries, the churches in her name sprang up on both banks of the river, from the source to the sea. There are more than 50 churches, chapels and chantries devoted to the Mother of God, an astonishing number for a river that extends for only 215 miles. The connection has not been noticed in books upon the Thames, but it is one of deep significance in the history of a river that has always been associated with the great mother of primeval beliefs that predate those of Celtic myth. There are strange laws of association at work here. In Irish myth, Bridget was the goddess of fertility, and also the swan goddess, and according to Robert Graves in The White Goddess, 1948, in medieval Irish poetry, Mary was equally plainly identified with Bridget. The great goddesses of the river in ancient and classical myth, Isis in particular, are thus associated with the Virgin Queen and Mother of God. Isis herself was once the Mother Goddess, the emblem of fertility and the womb of rebirth. It is not a great leap of faith from Isis to the Virgin. There is a strange reference in William Harrison's The Description of Britain, 1587, to the Church of St. Mary in Reading, when he refers to those natives which call the aforesaid church by the name of St. Mary Orderies, or St. Mary over Isis, or Ice. The names became conflated and substituted. Mary is simply the latest and perhaps the most powerful of all the water goddesses. The river was in legend and superstition also associated with the Virgin. Virgins would bathe in the Thames so that they might become fertile. It is one of the oldest myths of the river. So who better to bless the water than the Virgin herself? The ruins. The Normans, like all previous invaders, understood the benevolent aspects of the river. They had come upon what was essentially a civilized and stable society in the Thames region, in many ways in advance of their own culture, and they did not attempt to alter it in any significant fashion. It can in fact be claimed that the region civilized its new inhabitants. The parish boundaries and the county boundaries were preserved. The hamlets and villages by the Thames remained intact, albeit under new lordship. They maintained a pattern of settlement that had persisted for more than 1,000 years, and perhaps for much longer. Many of the Norman and later medieval churches were built on Saxon foundations. There were occasional changes of name in villages with a French accent, such as Kingston Blount and Compton Beauchamp, but the ancient nomenclature was in general respected. But the Normans did in part alter the appearance of the river. They built palaces and castles and fortresses beside it. They built the Tower of London as a solemn token of the king's strength over the adjacent city. In its original state, it was essentially the White Tower, La Blanche Tour, made of Caen stone sailed up the Thames from Normandy. They built Baynard's Castle, or Castle Baynard, on the banks of the river near the present Blackfriars. They constructed the castle of Windsor on a high knoll of chalk as another example of military preeminence. It was here, in 1070, that William I celebrated Christmas. He also laid out hunting grounds in the vicinity and enforested many other stretches along the Thames. It can hardly be claimed that the Normans inaugurated the passion for building royal palaces beside the Thames. In the 8th century, Offa had built a palace near the church at Benson, and there was a Saxon palace at Ewe Elm described by Leyland. There was also a Saxon palace in Kempsford. Canute had built at Westminster, and there had been a hall in the place now known as Old Windsor. It can be said, however, that the Normans were the first fully to exploit the connection of the river with royal power. They essentially created the Sovereign's River, from the Tower to Windsor. The Charter of William I declares that Windsor came into the possession of the king because that place seems commodious for the king by reason of the nearness of the river and the forest for hunting and many other conveniences, being likewise a place fit for the king's retirement. These conveniences may in part help to explain the ubiquity of royal palaces by the river. From the 11th to the 16th centuries, there were built 6 others below Windsor. They were Hampton Court and Richmond, Greenwich, and Whitehall. There was a royal palace at Bermondsey, erected by Edward III in the middle of the 14th century, of which a few stones remain. And then, of course, there is the Tower of London itself. It can be said in general that the towns along the river were designed principally as strongholds or as defensive settlements. Oxford is essentially an island fortress. Windsor Castle itself is set upon an ancient mound that may have been the site of very early fortifications. Cricklade and Lechlade are protected by the Churn and the Leach as well as by the Thames. Wallingford is protected by marsh as well as water. That is why mints were set up in Wallingford, Oxford, and Cricklade. They were well known to be secure places. The ancient name for Wallingford was Gallina, Gwallanford, from the British words gwal, hen, meaning old fortification. The Thames has always been of paramount importance in time of conflict. The earthworks at Cinodon, the permanent garrisons along the river associated with the British chieftain Ambrosius, the armed camp on the Isle of Sheppey, the Viking encampment at Fulham, the battle at Kempsford between Ethelmund of the Whickers and Woxton of Wiltshire in the early 9th century, the siege of the Tower of London by the Yorkists in 1460, all tell the same story. The conflict between Stephen and Matilda in the earlier part of the 12th century was in part a contest of ownership of the castles along the Thames. The river is the vital link to London and prosperity. That is why other notables have flocked to the river, among them the secular and ecclesiastical leaders of the country. The Strand between the city and Westminster was lined with bishops' palaces. York House, Winchester House, and Durham House, the residences of the Bishop of York, the Bishop of Winchester, and the Bishop of Durham, respectively, were built on the banks of the Thames. Lambeth Palace, built as a residence for the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1200, is less than a mile upstream on the opposite bank. As late as 1657, when the Tudor magnificence of the Thames had departed, James Howell remarked in Londinopolis upon the stately palaces that are built on both sides of her banks so thick, which made divers foreign ambassadors to affirm that the most glorious sight in the world, take water and land together, was to come upon a high tide from Gravesend and shoot the bridge to Westminster. At a slightly earlier date, Michael Drayton celebrated the Strand, meaning literally the stretch of land that runs along the river, as expressing the wealth and bravery of the land. It is such a familiar pattern of residence that it generally goes unremarked. But why should the leaders of the land wish to live in close proximity to the Thames? Precisely because from the very earliest times it has been the site of power. Notable people have lived by the river as a matter of instinct and of custom. Spiritual leaders in particular seem to have claimed the river as their proper home. The same pattern persists in later centuries. The Houses of Parliament are built by the river, despite the risks of riverine attack. County Hall is on the south bank of the Thames, as is the present headquarters of the Greater London Authority. The major public buildings of the city seem naturally to find their place beside the Thames. There was one other notable contribution by the Normans and their medieval successors to the life of the Thames. It lies in the expansion of religious communities by the river. They have all now disappeared or lie in ruins, but in earlier centuries they were a great presence by the Thames. They included the monastic and conventual establishments of Godstow, Bisham, and Medmenham, the abbeys of Abingdon and Reading and Dorchester, Aynsham, Rewley and Osney, Streatley and Chertsey and Cholsey, the priories of Cricklade and Lechlade, the nunneries of Burnham and Little Marlow. Certain of them had existed as early as the 7th century, in particular the Benedictine monasteries of Westminster, Chertsey, and Abingdon. These establishments were in large part the civilizing force within the Thames Valley. With their skill in estate management, their commitment to scholarship, and their connection to the sources of continental learning, the Benedictine monks did more than anyone else to enlighten the early years of Saxon rule by the river. In the historic Thames, Hilaire Belloc goes so far as to state that the new country that emerged in the course of the Saxon era was actually created by the Benedictine monks. There is, of course, the historic foundation of Westminster Abbey, which can be dated to the beginning of the 7th century, when the first Christian king of the East Saxons, Siebert, patronized a Benedictine monastery here. His tomb now rests in the abbey. The early monastery was erected upon a triangular patch of waste ground known appropriately as Thorny Island. This island of shingle and marsh and thorns was bounded by the Thames and by 2 small streams that issued into the river. It was an unpromising spot, but the black-cowled monks were known for their skill in turning waste and wilderness into flourishing land. The later history of the abbey is better known, with the work of Edward the Confessor in 1050 and the rebuilding of the church by Henry III in the 13th century. It has remained a sacred place ever since, a river shrine where all the monarchs of England, with the exception of Edward V and Edward VIII, have been crowned. In an 8th century charter it was described as the terrible place, the adjective here meaning sacred or holy terror. Such places seem to spring up naturally by the river. In the building of Westminster Abbey, the Thames was associated with supernatural visitation. A legend recounts the appearance of St. Peter on the south bank of the river at Lambeth, from where he asked a fisherman to row him over to Thorny Island. There, with his own hands, Peter performed the ceremony of consecration. At the time of Edward the Confessor, a monk of Westminster was vouchsafed a vision in which the apostle commanded the monarch to restore the abbey church in the place which I chose and loved, honoured with my presence, and made illustrious by my miracles. This church by the river became the hallowed sanctuary of such relics as blood from Christ's side and milk from the Virgin Mary, a beam from the holy manger, and a fragment of the true cross. It also became the sepulchral church of England, a vast mortuarium by the side of the river in the spirit of the prehistoric burial sites that have been excavated in recent years. The origins of the Benedictine monasteries of Chertsey and Abingdon are also surrounded by legends and stories of supernatural intervention, but their immediate and intimate connection with the river is better attested. Both of these foundations were established upon marshy or swampy ground, but both commanded a superior position on the Thames itself. The monastery at Abingdon, for example, was erected a mile downstream from an ancient ford. The monks eventually diverted the course of the river so that it flowed beside their walls. At a later date they bridged the river at 2 points and built a causeway to link the 2 bridges. They were adept at exploiting the possibilities of the river, which is one reason why they originally chose the setting of the Thames. The monastery was also the gateway to the fertile valley that is still known as the Vale of the White Horse. The consolidation and expansion of the religious foundations of the Thames Valley really began after the Conquest. The abbeys of Westminster, Chertsey, and Abingdon were enlarged and reinforced. They were then joined by a sequence of abbeys that grew up along the course of the river. From the mother house of Cluny in Burgundy came the establishment of Reading Abbey, of Bermondsey Abbey, and of Osney Abbey. Then there were the abbeys of Aynsham and Rewley, the priories of Lechlade and Cricklade, the abbey and monastery of Dorchester, the charter house at Sheen, the little nunneries of Ankerwyck, Burnham, Littlemore, Goring and Little Marlow, the foundations of Medmenham and Bisham and Cholsey. These are only a selection of the religious communities that sprang up by the Thames, claiming it as their natural territory. The religious orders possessed most of the land beside the Thames. It has been estimated that the 8 largest religious houses owned between them manors comprising almost the whole length of the upper river. Closer to London, the religious orders administered and farmed Sunning, Wargrave, Tilehurst, Chertsey, Egham, Cobham, Richmond, Ham, Mortlake, Sion, Sheen, Kew, Chiswick, and Staines. This is, of course, not to mention their extensive possessions along the banks of the Thames in London itself, nor their possessions within Oxford. They seem almost to be an emanation or extension of the Thames, a spiritual body that rested upon the river. They became the centre of organised life and of industry. The great abbeys built the bridges that can still be seen across the river, and they supervised the agricultural life of the communities in which they were established. The Benedictines were well known for their agricultural expertise, for example, particularly in cutting back forests and in reclaiming marshes for arable land. These skills were all the more necessary beside the banks of the Thames. They were also the recipients of rich donations and bequests from all over the country, and indeed became the largest landowners in the kingdom. They were in every sense the centre of the life of the Thames. They established the local prosperity of the region, and if the Thames Valley is still one of the principal areas where the economic and technological wealth of the country is situated, it is in some part owing to the efforts of the religious orders 6 or 7 centuries ago. There was a habit of residence by the banks of the Thames long before the monastic orders arrived there, but the great foundations materially assisted the process of settlement and cultivation. We can also provide a working model of an abbey's relationship with the river. The water first pours into the corn mill, and then, after moving the wheels that grind the grain, it is diverted into the next building, where it flows into the boiler that is heated to prepare the beer for the monks' drinking. It is then drawn into the fulling machines for the shrinking and cleaning of cloth, where it raises and lowers the heavy hammers and mallets employed therein. Then it enters the tannery of the abbey. Other branches and diversions of the river are also used in cooking, watering, and washing. Finally, at the close of its labours, it carries away the refuse and scours all clean. The Thames was the Proteus of the working world. The abbeys were also the centre of national education. One of the abbots of Abingdon was the most celebrated historian of early England, Geoffrey of Monmouth, and in that abbey one of the sons of William the Conqueror was instructed. There are apocryphal reports of Saxon colleges being established at Lechlade and Cricklade, near the source of the Thames, but another riverine foundation has a more authentic history. The monastery of St. Friderswide at Oxford was the predecessor of and direct inspiration for the university itself. By the 9th century it had become a centre for learning. Amongst the earliest to endow it was King Alfred himself, the patron of English scholarship, and Oxford became known as the fountain whence issued many learned clerks. The king may be said to have restored or re-established it, because there are reports that his nominees as teachers, Grimbald and John the Monk, had to contest for supremacy with the old students of the place. By the end of the 11th century, Theobald of Etampes was describing himself as Magister Oxfordiae. It should be recalled that Oxford is almost entirely encircled by water. As John Wycliffe declared, not unworthily is it called the vineyard of the Lord. It was founded by the Holy Fathers and situated in a splendid site watered by rills and fountains, surrounded by meadows, pastures, plains, and glades. It has been rightly called the house of God and the gate of heaven. But at the time of the Reformation and the dissolution of the religious establishments, the organised religious life of the Thames was all but destroyed. The smaller houses were the first to be closed. Then the commissioners turned their vengeance upon the larger establishments, among them Godstow Abbey and Osney Abbey, Abingdon Abbey and the Friary at Reading, as well as the friaries and monastic colleges of Oxford. The priories of Lechlade and Cricklade, the nunneries of Burnham and Little Marlow, were also extinguished. Generations of religious observance and ceremony, conducted by the river, were removed at the instigation of a sovereign who cared as little for the sacred history of the river as for the spiritual heritage of the nation itself. Only the Abbey of Dorchester and Westminster Abbey survived the general destruction and decay. The rest were looted and rifled. The refectory at Abingdon became a malt house, while the refectory at Hurley became a stable. The religious establishments of Sutton, Bisham, and Medmenham became part of private houses. The occasional wall or fish pond may survive. There are fragments of graveyards or cloisters to be glimpsed. In 19th-century studies of the Thames there are engravings of ruins. But even these ruins have, for the most part, disappeared. All that remains of Reading Abbey, for example, are some scattered masses of flint rubble from which the stone facing has been removed. In its original form, this great 12th century foundation would have resembled Durham Cathedral, a splendour of the riverine landscape. Its ruins are now not much visited. It is doubtful if many of the inhabitants of Reading know that they are there. This was the abbey in which Henry I was buried, and in which Henry II was offered the crown of Jerusalem. Thomas à Becket consecrated the church in the reign of that king. Here John of Gaunt was married, and the English Parliament assembled 3 times. In the cloisters of Reading Abbey was written one of the loveliest and most celebrated of all English songs, Summer Is a-Comin' In. This 4-part song, the first of its kind, was written by John of Fauncet in the 13th century. It is the only part of the abbey that can be said truly to have survived. Of the nunnery at Godstow, the line of one wall remains. Nothing of the original structure of the 12th century has survived. Of Chertsey Abbey, Stukely wrote, in Itinerarium Curiosum, 1724, that so total a dissolution I scarcely ever saw, as if they meant to defeat even the inherent sanctity of the land. Human bones of the abbots, monks, and great personages who were buried in great numbers in the church and cloisters which lay on the south side of the church were spread thick all over the garden, so that one may pick up handfuls of bits of bones at a time everywhere among the garden stuff. Of the abbey itself nothing remains but a piece of broken gateway and a few stones from its once encompassing wall. Liquid history. In the 16th century, the Thames became the river of royal pomp and procession. This was the river down which Henry VIII and preeminently Elizabeth I sailed in state. It was the river of pageant. Gilt barges decorated with banners and streamers, awnings and tapestries, flags sewn with tiny bells that rang out in the breeze, musicians playing their sackbuts and cornets upon the water, barges and galleys swathed in cloth of gold and arras. It was the river of pleasure and the river of spectacle. It was the stage upon which the rulers and principals of the kingdom could display themselves to the populace. It was the theatre of water. Anne Boleyn, dressed in cloth of gold, processed down the Thames for her coronation in 1533. It was said that the barges following her stretched for 4 miles. On that day, according to contemporary reports, there were trumpets, shawms, and other divers instruments all the way playing and making great melody. The barges themselves were gorgeously garnished with banners, pennons, and targets richly covered. The state barge of the Lord Mayor led the procession, adorned by flags and pennons hung with rich tapestries and ornamented on the outside with scutcheons of metal suspended on cloth of gold and silver. It was the triumph of the Thames as much as of the ill-fated Queen, the appropriate setting for extravagance and conspicuous wealth. It was the same river that carried Anne Boleyn to her beheading 3 years later. It was the same route, from Greenwich to the Tower, but the river was now the baleful conduit of death. This was also the river upon which Sir Thomas More and later the young Princess Elizabeth were taken to the Tower. It was the river down which the body of Elizabeth was taken to the Palace of Whitehall. In Annales Britanniae, 1615, William Camden wrote that the Queen was brought by water to Whitehall, at every stroke the oars did let tears fall. More clung about the barge, fish under water wept out their eyes of pearl and swam blind after. It was the river that seemed to curl through the affairs of state, noble or ignoble, bloody or benign, and was an intrinsic part of royal London. That is also why the great palaces of the nobility and the clergy were built on the banks of the river, so that they might be near the ultimate source of power. Although the belief in the water's divinity had apparently been dispelled, the continuing invocation of nymphs and sea-gods, not least in the Thames pageants, suggests that there was some residual faith in the deities of the river. It was the river that blessed the monarch, not the reverse. The Thames was seen as the microcosm of the kingdom, incorporating past and present, the world of pastoral and the world of the city, the centre of secular as well as of religious activities, the site of sports and carnivals. It was considered to be another Helicon, where Apollo and his muses had alighted, so that under its benign influence London surpassed Rome and Athens. The excitement and energy of London were the excitement and energy of the Thames. It was also the highway along which all the traffic of London passed, not just for the fishermen in their coracles, and not just for the merchants in their vessels from Spain and the Low Countries, but for the ordinary citizens who used the Thames as the most convenient means of transport through London. Of course, they travelled across the water from north to south, especially when London Bridge could be busy and crowded, but also they sailed along the north bank to the various stairs, where they could alight and continue their journey. The streets of the city were narrow and perilous, and it was considered safer and easier to travel by water. The number of small boats, barges, lighters, tilt boats and ferries upon the river was a source of perpetual interest to foreign observers. And of course there were hundreds of watermen, with their boats for hire, the water continually in motion with their labouring oars. There were many occasions when the press of boats was so great that traffic came to a halt in what became known as a lock, or jam. This was the Thames, well known and even celebrated for its crowded wharves and busy shores. It is not at all surprising that the citizens congregated along its banks, since in the 16th century the majority of Londoners still earned their living directly or indirectly from the river. From a distance, it was said, the Thames looked like a forest of masts, and at any one time there were estimated to be some 2,000 vessels on the water, as well as 3,000 watermen. In a map from the middle of that century, the various stairs or landing places are depicted as places of great and restless activity. It was the cartographer's way of asserting the primacy of the river. The Thames supplied London with goods from the known world, with spices and furs and wine. Here came the Venetian galleys, with their stock of merchandise from Constantinople and Damascus, joined by the three-masted ships from the Low Countries, with their cargoes of fur and timber. But the river also carried the great barges of hay and fuel, without which the city could not have survived. There was the story of an alderman who had been told that Queen Mary was so annoyed with the city that she intended to remove Parliament and the courts of justice to some other place. He asked whether she meant also to divert the river of Thames from London. On being told that she had no means to do so, he replied that then, by God's grace, we shall do well enough at London, whatsoever become of the term and Parliament. It was the river down which the first explorers sailed. Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor set sail from Deptford in 1553 with a letter addressed to all kings, princes, rulers, judges, and governors of the earth. They were on a voyage of discovery, searching for a northern route to the Indies, but the one surviving vessel landed on the Russian coast. This was the beginning of trade with the merchants of Moscow. When the ships came near Greenwich, the courtiers came running out, and the common people flocked together, standing very thick upon the shore. At a later date, Colonel John Smith left from Blackwall, and after a perilous voyage, established the colony of Jamestown in Virginia. The Mayflower sailed from Rotherhithe. It seemed then that the waters of the world might be interpreted as one extended Thames. The Turkey Company was later established as a result of the trading voyages, and on the last day of the 16th century the Queen signed a charter for the establishment of the English East India Company. The merchants and adventurers of the Hudson Bay Company, of the East India Company itself, and of the West India Company started their travels on the river. So when Wenceslaus Hollard depicted the river in the 1630s in his famous panoramic map of London, it was appropriate that he should depict the banks and stairs, wherries and barges as combined in a vast network of activity. In contrast, the streets and houses of the city seemed deserted, as if all the energy and business of London were concentrated upon the flowing Thames. The names of the wharves are clearly marked for ease of reference, with Paulus Wharf, Queenhithe, the Three Cranes, Stilliard, Coal Harbour, the Old Swan, and the river itself is filled with vessels of every description. Below London Bridge the great merchant ships are docked, while Mercury, the god of commerce, is pointing to the cartouche of London itself. This vista became the model for many later maps and representations, so that the prospect of London stretching from the river became the single most important vision of the city. The Thames represented the city's destiny. It was how London was imagined. During the early stages of the Civil War, the Thames remained a royalist stronghold along its middle reaches. The river was, after all, the source and site of ancient or traditional power. Just as it had once harboured old Catholic families, recusants under Elizabeth, so it acted as a refuge for those who supported the king in his struggle against Parliament. Many royalist and Catholic houses, beside the river and its tributaries, were besieged by parliamentary troops, among them Maple Durham House, Blount's Court, and Basing House. There were royalist garrisons at Reading and at Oxford. Oxford became the temporary royal capital for Charles I. By two of the river's most ancient bridges, those of Radcot and Newbridge, there were battles and skirmishes. At Radcot Bridge, in 1645, Prince Rupert fought off a parliamentary army. The prize of Kingston was sought by both sides, with the monarch's troops being ousted by parliamentary soldiers who in their turn were expelled by royalist troops retreating from the Battle of Turnham Green. Then a parliamentary army returned and held the town until the end of the Civil War. Prince Rupert destroyed 2 parliamentary regiments who had set up a garrison by the river at Brentford. Many of the soldiers were drowned in the Thames. The royal river, of course, celebrated the return of royal favour. When, on the 23rd of August, 1662, Charles II was rowed from Hampton Court to Whitehall with his bride, Catherine of Braganza, he was imitating the Tudor pageants of Henry and Elizabeth in a deliberate attempt to renew his own majesty. He was associating himself and his family with the history of the river. As he sat upon the royal barge with his bride, he was inviting the blessing of the river. He received it in the shape of an actor playing Isis, who sang out, accompanied by music, "Divinest pair, Isis, to meet your unmatched loves, kisses your sacred feet." The royal pageant had been entitled Aqua Triumphalis, and according to Evelyn, it was the most magnificent triumph that ever floated on the Thames, considering the innumerable boats and vessels dressed and adorned with all imaginable pomp, but above all, the thrones, arches, pageants, and other representations, stately barges of the Lord Mayor and companies, with various inventions, music, and peals of ordnance, both from the vessels and shore. It was a chance for Londoners, in particular, to exorcise their previous association with Cromwell and the Protectorate. A London crowd had gathered for the execution of the present monarch's father, and it was also an opportunity for the Thames to be recognised again as the sovereign river of England. That is why, at the time of the plague and the fire, it became the instinctive place of refuge. It was part of the river's status as a boundary that it was believed that it might act as a frontier or defence against flame and disease. In Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, 1722, written some years after the events described, there is an account of a waterman at Poplar who acted as a carrier and postman for those families who had taken to the river and had secured themselves in vessels anchored in the river. "All these ships," he explained, "have families on board, of their merchants and owners and such like, who have locked themselves up and live on board, closed shut in, for fear of infection." Defoe estimated that there were 10,000 people sheltering on the Thames in this secluded manner. The riverside was lined with boats, too, and many Londoners had decamped to the estuary, where they lived upon the barren marshland of that area. The precautions did not in general check the contagion. The plague had been carried into London by the Thames itself, spreading from the Rattus rattus, otherwise known as the black rat or the ship rat. The infection reached the ships, creating havoc among the refugees who had believed themselves to be safe. The watermen who used their boats as houses were also struck down. They were found dead in their wherries, riding the tide. Of the fire a year later, Pepys reports that after watching the flames from the tower, he walked down to the waterside and hired a boat to take him towards London Bridge. The Thames had already become the scene of intense activity, with the citizens and their families removing their household goods by flinging them into the river or bringing them into lighters that lay off. The poorer people stayed in their houses until the fire came too close, at which point they began running into boats or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. Later that night, Pepys described the Thames as full of lighters and boats taking in goods, and goods swimming in the water, and only I observed that hardly one lighter or boat in 3 that had the goods of a house in it, but there was a pair of virginals in it. But the river once more proved an illusory refuge. Pepys reported that all over the Thames, with one's faces in the wind, you were almost burned with a shower of fire drops. Evelyn completed the picture in his diaries, with an account of the Thames covered with goods floating, all the barges and boats laden with what some had time and courage to save. Oh, the miserable and calamitous spectacle! The heat and the smoke became too intense, and those on the river were forced to land on the southern bank and fly to the fields, or sail out of the immediate neighbourhood of London. The rebuilding of London after the fire, of course, greatly changed the prospect of the city from the Thames. It also altered the appearance of the banks themselves. The warehouses and quays, destroyed or damaged, were rebuilt. The streets leading down from the city were also rebuilt, their houses now constructed of russet or yellow brick, and above the roofs rose the gleaming steeples of the 51 churches that Christopher Wren, the King's Assistant Surveyor-General, restored or built again. It was a more solid, a grander riverscape than that of the medieval or Tudor city. This was nowhere more evident than in the reclamation of the Fleet River that flowed down into the Thames by Blackfriars. It had become no more than an open sewer in the heart of the capital, making its noisome way through the Fleet Valley, but under Wren's superintendence it was widened and cleaned up. It became a navigable cut as far as Holborn Bridge in the centre of the city. It was crossed by newly built bridges and lined with wharves and warehouses. It was a measure of Wren's determination to scour London and the Thames of their past. The King had decreed that we do resolve and declare that there shall be a fair quay or wharf on all the river side. As a result, there emerged a plan for a continuous Thames quay, a model of progress and efficiency on the north bank of the Thames that would complete London's preeminence as a trading nation. It was to take the place of the jumble or warren of wooden sheds and warehouses, stairs and alleys that characterized the old riverscape. It was to stretch from the Temple to the Tower of London at a width of 40 feet. It was to be lined with grand buildings, of which the new Customs House, also designed by Wren, was the exemplar. It was to represent the wholesale transformation of the river. On both sides of London Bridge, the Thames was to be overlooked by new building that reflected the spirit of a city awakened and renewed. It did not quite succeed in the manner intended. Below the bridge, private and unplanned quays had already been erected before the programme of public works had begun. They had been needed immediately after the fire, not least to bring provisions and materials for the army of building workers who had migrated to the city in the first stages of rebuilding. It did not seem practicable to begin again. Above the bridge, Wren reported to the monarch that everywhere the area was enclosed and encumbered with pales or brick walls, irregular houses and buildings, piles of timber, billets, faggots, and heaps of coals, many boarded sheds and several great lay stalls, the old towers of Baynard's castle yet standing. The rebuilding was occasional and sporadic, but there were specific accomplishments. A new fishmonger's hall, for example, was built. Thames Street was widened. New wharves were constructed at Dowgate and at Puddle Dock. Bridewell was largely rebuilt. Houses were erected along the side of the river in more orderly fashion. The level of Thames Street was also raised 3 feet to ensure against inundation by water rather than fire, and there were additions to the litany of great buildings along the Thames. Preeminent among them stood the Cathedral Church of St. Paul, with its dome of shining Portland stone. Wren changed the Thames just as he changed London. He designed the hospital at Chelsea for wounded soldiers, and then the hospital at Greenwich for naval men. The official or administrative life of the river was partly his invention. It was now being celebrated as the calm river, the river that did not rage, the river without extremes, the river that did not generally overflow its banks in excessive vigour. In that sense, it became an image of the new dispensation of the renewed kingdom, averse to extremism and the enthusiasm of any faction. The river incorporated the myth of the nation. The waters of life. Water is utterly familiar and yet altogether elusive. That is why it has been described in terms of negation. It is odourless, it is colourless, it is tasteless. The epitaph upon the headstone of John Keats, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water," is the token of one who believed that he had left no trace. Until a relatively late date, the natural philosophers and scientists considered water to be an indivisible element, and only after 1783, through the combined efforts of Cavendish, Watt, and Lavoisier, was it recognized to be an inorganic compound of hydrogen and oxygen. But still, ancient beliefs clustered around the chemistry, with oxygen considered to be the father and hydrogen the mother of this substance. Yet water is the matrix and nurse of all life. It is perhaps the oldest thing upon the earth. It has remained unchanged in every respect for 3,500 million years. The seas were formed in the depths of pre-Cambrian time, and there is not one drop more or less than at that inconceivable beginning. The water of the Thames may once have fallen from the back of a pliosaur or filled the bath of Archimedes. That is where the enchantment of the river lies. It is the deep and ancient force, the thrust and stir of creation. The noise of its waters is the sound of burgeoning life. And all the liquid world, as Abraham Cowley put it, is one extended Thames. It is the first element of life in another sense. The child in the womb lives and develops within the embrace of water, growing within the membranous sac, and of course the human frame is itself composed principally of water. So was Neanderthal man. So was Cro-Magnon man. We are all part of the same texture. It has been estimated by biochemists that the amount of salt in human protoplasm, some 0.9%, was precisely that within the ancient seas where life first began. We are born within primordial waters. The fact that the human body is by weight 60% water may help to explain why the river has been granted human characteristics such as unpredictability and fierceness. What better way is there to symbolize purity, too, than the image of clear and limpid water? It may also help to explain the intimacy with which water is associated. The water is like blood coursing through the veins, and in that consonance between the veins of the human body and the rivers of the earth there is a strange pull of sympathy between the human being and the running water. Motionless waters evoke death, as the poems and stories of Edgar Allan Poe testify. When we look at our reflection in water, we are looking at ourselves in a double sense. It has also been described as the mother of all elements, with Isaac Newton's belief that that rare substance water can be transformed by continued fermentation into the more dense substances of animals, vegetables, salts, stones, and various earths. That is why the myth of purity is so important, since motherhood and purity are deemed to be cognate in the myths of human origin. It is, in fact, the attribute of water to be able to purify itself. The river metabolizes waste in the manner of a living organism by absorbing oxygen from the air and from plants. The oxygen then burns organic waste material. But in a more general sense, water is spiritually pure. It is the renovator and protector of the world. It redeems ugliness. It is the source of health and strength. It palliates the human senses, refreshing to the touch, calming to the eye, and melodious to the ear. There seems to be an instinctive harmony in the life and appearance of the riverbank, for example, at least where the set of the stream and the nature of the soil have not been displaced by human activity. Water is the quintessence of everything and of nothing. It communicates easily with all manifestations of itself, effortlessly becoming one and finding a common level. So what is its identity? It has been compared with time, death, and consciousness, but in that sense, too, it has been compared with everything and nothing. It is of protean appearance, changing its shape from water to steam to ice. Solid, liquid, or gaseous, it is forever elusive. When Coleridge watched the course of a waterfall in the Lake District, he was moved to write of the continual change of the matter, the perpetual sameness of the form. It is an awful image and shadow of God and the world. But this changefulness, this state of perpetual becoming, is also part of its energy. It is also an aspect of its power. Water can defy gravity by moving uphill. It will wear down and dissolve the toughest metal. It has created the plains and valleys of the earth. It does not abide obstacles. It can destroy mountains. A single drop of rain exerts a force of 2.3 pounds per square inch, 0.165 kgf per square centimetre. A thunderstorm unleashes the energy of a large atomic bomb. Water never can be wholly still, with the forces of radiation and gravity, heat and movement all around it. Leonardo noted down in 8 folios 730 conclusions on water, of which 64 were concerned with water in movement. He was considered to be a master of water, and was employed as an adviser on its power in fields as various as flooding, energy, and transport. He understood the might of the river. He was particularly interested in the formation of the vortex, since there, if anywhere, is to be found a microcosm of water itself. The flowing river is, after all, part of what has become known as the hydrologic cycle, the vortex of the earth, the circle of life. The process, not fully proven until as late as the mid-17th century, has the twin merits of harmony and simplicity. The water evaporates from the sea and land, and is thus drawn into the atmosphere. It falls back as rain or snow or sleet, and thus replenishes the rivers and watercourses that return it to the sea. It has been estimated that each year 95,000 cubic miles of water rise into the atmosphere. Of these, 80,000 cubic miles ascend directly from the oceans, to which return 71,000 cubic miles. The rest of the falling water replenishes the lakes and streams and rivers, or nourishes the land. The trees and plants are, of course, part of this endless circle, and each day a single birch tree can transpire some 70 gallons, 318 litres, of water. Larger trees can disperse hundreds of gallons. One drop of water may spend a few days in a river or a few hundreds of thousands of years locked within the ground, but that drop is not lost. Eventually it will return. There is a manuscript map of Kent in the 18th century treatise Anchographia, 1743, which shows the drainage system of the river in the form of a man half kneeling upon the ground. It is a haunting image, as if the human shape had risen out of the topography, like the ghost or spirit of the place. He holds a pail with which he pours the waters into the sea. The hydrologic cycle propounds another mystery. It is best expressed in the words of Ecclesiastes 1:7. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. There is a glimpse here of some divine apotheosis, when that which is filled to overflowing can never contain enough. All flows into the one. Seneca meditated upon the flow of rivers, and thus, contemplating them, we should reverence a fountain of life flowing into itself, simple, self-moved, and self-worked, a knowledge surpassing every kind of knowledge, and always contemplating itself through itself. The image of bliss or perfection may be found in the contemplation of the circle rather than of constant movement. The movement of the Thames itself, restless and heaving, as it proceeds downward to the great sea, can provoke such reflections. It is a beneficent cycle that has affected the metaphors of time and human destiny. It has no beginning and no end, or rather the beginning and the end cannot be identified with any certainty. There is no trace of a beginning, and no thought of an end. It suggests some interior harmony that we may extrapolate into the cosmos itself. Plato believed that the human body, like nature, adhered to some universal law of circulation. The process of life is in a constant state of becoming. All of these attributes affect our perception of the Thames itself. The leveller. Water is the greatest of equalizers. It is well enough known that water seeks an even level, but this is more than a metaphor. Throughout its history it has been understood that the river is free to all people. In the Magna Carta, sealed by the banks of the Thames, the great rivers of the English kingdom were granted to all men and women alike. A parliamentary committee of the 19th century declared the Thames to be an ancient and free highway with the attendant right of the public to move boats over any and every part of the river through which the Thames water flows. The monarch does not own the river, despite many tendentious claims to the contrary, any more than the Corporation of London owns that part of the river that flows through the city. In truth, the river belongs to no one. The water of the Thames was available both to rich and poor, whether for bathing or for cleansing, for cooking or for drinking. The need for it was so universal that it was deemed to be common to all. A pamphlet of 1600 quotes with approval the Muslim belief that no money nor fee should be exacted for the use of water which God had freely bestowed on poor and rich. In the same period, the Thames provided the setting for the festivals that united the people of the city. The food of the Thames fed everyone. The riverside was also the home of rich and poor, with palaces and hovels almost literally side by side. As Sir William Davenant described the northern bank of the Thames in 1656, "Here a lord, there a dyer, and places of the worst kind between both." In his early drawings of the river, Turner contrasts the Baroque architecture along the river banks with the neighbouring waterworks and coal barges. The river actively worked against hierarchy and division of all kinds, particularly because water is a dissolving and unifying element. The Thames also provided work and profit for the diverse people along its banks. At the height of the boating craze of the late 19th century, the locks and weirs saw the close congregation of lords and cockneys. This resulted in what one observer called spontaneous gaiety, as if the values of the ordinary world had for a moment been turned upside down. It is this innate egalitarianism that explains the water language of the boatmen conventionally directed against their ostensibly richer or more socially superior passengers. Thus we have the association of the Thames with various levelling movements. In the late 14th century, the rebellion of Jack Straw against the exactions of Richard II of the poll tax was largely instigated by the disaffection of the Thames fishermen along the estuary in villages such as Mucking and Vantage. The first riots broke out in Fobbing, and the county history of Essex records that the portion of the country most implicated in the revolt was along the Thames shore. The river was involved in much of the violent action. There were rebel uprisings in Barking and at Dartford, and there were incendiary riots in Gravesend. One contingent of rebels marched from Blackheath to Southwark and to Lambeth, where they stormed the Archbishop's palace. The river seems to call forth the defenders of liberty. In the same riverine spirit, the bargemen of the Thames were once known as the Sons of Liberty, albeit in an ironical sense. In the 15th century, the sect of the Lollards, opposed to hierarchical tenets as well as the corruption of the established church, was strongly represented in the Thames Valley. They were well established, for example, at Marlow and at Farringdon, at Abingdon and at Buscott. They were also active in the vicinity of Oxford. The Lollard Rebellion of 1431 was in fact crushed at Abingdon itself, where they could expect the most loyal support, but Lollard ideas were still retained in the regions around the river. The Baptists emerged most powerfully, for example, in old Lollard strongholds. The connection of the Baptist movement with the river itself, not least in the ritual of immersion, suggests how much the presence of the Thames can be felt in the espousal of egalitarian creeds. The Levellers, the 16th-century group of Republicans and Democrats who emerged in the period of the Civil War and Commonwealth, congregated in the Church of St. Mary by the banks of the river at Putney in 1647. It was here that they engaged in the Putney debates and put forward an agreement of the people, or new social contract. Then, 2 years later, Walton-on-Thames became the setting for the experiment in living conducted by the diggers under the inspiration of Gerard Winstanley. They proclaimed themselves to be the true Levellers, and proceeded to cultivate the common ground of St. George's Hill. They espoused a primitive form of communism derived from the principles of Magna Carta. So the Thames runs through all of these levelling proceedings. For a short time in the 1990s, a village was established by the river at Battersea, named Land and Freedom, dedicated to the principles of communal equality and ecological rectitude. It was following an ancient calling. You can feel free on the river. Indeed, the Thames itself seems to encourage some dissolution of the identity. It encourages various forms of communal revelry, such as the frost fairs that were conducted on the frozen river during various preternaturally cold episodes. All classes and sections of London society congregated on the river during these unnatural episodes. Straight comes an arch wag, a young son of a whore, and lays the squire's head where his heels were before. Class distinctions seem to disappear in the process of going upon the river, even in its frozen state, and through the centuries the Thames was an emblem of liberty. All the divisions and distinctions of dry land are washed away and erased. As Richard Jefferies says in The Modern Thames, 1885, on the river people do as they choose, and there does not seem to be any law at all, or at least there is no authority to enforce it, if it exists. The bargemen, for example, knew no law. They deemed themselves to be as free as the river gypsies. The various pilferers and smugglers who used the river as the focus of their activities genuinely believed that they were doing no wrong. That is why the establishment of the river police provoked such outrage. It is still considered somewhat offensive to ask someone on the river to desist from one activity or another. Some of the greatest radical enterprises of English history, in particular the Sailors' Revolt or Nore Mutiny of 1797 and the Dockers' Strike of 1889, have taken place upon the Thames. The river is the zone of liberty. End of Volume 1. Thames Sacred River continues with Volume 2, The Working River. Thames Sacred River is published by Random House Audiobooks, a division of the Random House Group. Copyright Peter Ackroyd, 2007. Copyright and recording, Random House Audiobooks. Peter Ackroyd has asserted his right under the CDPA 1988 to be identified as the author of this work.